of some of the things that we have talked about in the past that lead us to an investigation or an inspection of the Jonestown particulars in the first place. Everybody, well, not everybody, but most people, of course, are familiar with the basic story of Jonestown, of Jim Jones supposedly being a charismatic leader who led a bunch of black followers down into Guyana, a tiny country up on the northern coast of South America, and setting up a sort of a government in exile, a country in exile, and he and his followers setting up their own little society, and complaints about Jonestown filtering back to the United States government. And since most of the people in Jonestown were United States citizens, Congressman Leo Ryan, who represented a district right here in the area in San Mateo, where many of the constituents of Jonestown came from, was sent down on a fact-finding mission. He got down there, had a rather inconclusive meeting with Jones. Apparently, this is all the official story so far. Was told that there were people who wanted to leave. There's some question as to whether or not Ryan actually agreed to take some people out. But when Ryan's group went back to the Port Kaituma airstrip, they were attacked by people from Jonestown. Among them, allegedly, a man named Larry Layton, who we're going to be hearing about later. Several people were shot. Leo Ryan was one of them and died. And then Jones exhorted his followers to follow him into suicide because now their perfect Eden had been breached and they were going to be dragged back to slavery. Now, that's the official story. And several people basically have used Jonestown as an illustration of all kinds of things. Among other things, there's the danger of religious cults and people following these insane charismatic leaders. Now, of course, the question that is most important for our purposes was Jones purely a charismatic lunatic who happened to drag a bunch of people off into the jungle, or, as other people have insinuated, for reasons that we'll explain in just a moment, was Jones in fact working on a hidden agenda, and whose hidden agenda might it have been?
Well, one of the theories that has been advanced, and there's a great deal of evidence to support it at this point, is that Jim Jones' agenda was essentially drawn up for him by one aspect or another of the U.S. national security establishment. A number of different federal agencies and organizations have been connected in one way or another with Jonestown, notably the Central Intelligence Agency, and also perhaps the United States Army and some of its most prestigious and strategic research facilities. Specifically, as far as CIA goes, some of the names you want to know are George Philip Blakey, who essentially was a fellow who had worked for the Central Intelligence Agency in Angola on behalf of the UNITA organization in Angola. Now, George Philip Blakey put down the original $650,000 down deposit on the territory of the People's Temple in Guyana. Okay. Now, this fellow, George Philip Blakey, is married to a woman named Debbie Layton Blakey. Now, Debbie Layton Blakey is the brother of Larry Layton, Jr. Larry Layton was the fellow who allegedly led the Port Kaituma firing squad, which executed former U.S. Congressman Leo Ryan and a number of other people. Now, his father, Lawrence Layton Sr., as well as his mother, Lisa Layton, were members of the People's Temple also. Now, Larry Layton Sr., now George Philip Blakey is married to Debbie Layton Blakey, the brother of Larry Layton or Lawrence Layton Jr. Okay, George Philip Blakey works for CIA and UNITA. Also present at the massacre, the Jonestown Massacre, was a fellow named Richard Dwyer, who was CIA Chief of Mission in Guyana. And on that famous tape of Jim Jones exhorting his followers during the massacre, he can be heard, Jim Jones that is, can be heard saying, "Get Dwyer out of here." Okay? Now, Lawrence Layton Sr., the father of Larry Layton Jr. and Debbie Layton Blakey, he's a very interesting fellow, and we're going to talk about him in just a minute. Among the many things that he was involved with was he was in charge of research and development for the U.S. Army's Chemical and Biological Warfare Program at the Dugway Proving Grounds in Utah. Now, an interesting thing about Congressman Leo Ryan was that he was the co-author of the Hughes-Ryan Amendment, and what that had done was to oblige the Central Intelligence Agency to give Congress prior notification of impending covert action. And that amendment brought the Angola operation on behalf of UNITA to a halt. And of course, recall that George Philip Blakey was part of that operation. There's also an interesting connection to Jonestown. A woman who basically was killed in a very suspicious automobile accident, had her passport given to the only witness to link James, well, basically a witness who could discredit the only witness to link James Earl Ray to the place where he supposedly assassinated Martin Luther King from. And that woman would have been down. Her name was Grace Stevens or Grace Walden, depending on whether you use her married name. She was a common-law wife of Charles Q. Stevens, many times convicted drunk, and the only person to link James Earl Ray to the place where he supposedly assassinated Martin Luther King. Worth noting also that the Jonestown massacre totally diverted attention away from the House Select Committee on Assassinations hearings about Jonestown. Okay, so these are some of the intelligence connections with regard to Jonestown. There are others, and we speculated about the possibility of a connection between a project to experiment and use psychosurgery on prisoners at Nike missile sites in Southern California. It was basically to an institute to be set up in conjunction with UCLA for the study and prevention of violent behavior, and we speculated that perhaps the frustration of that project had given rise to Jonestown. And again, Nip Tuck referred to Mae Brussel, whose work is carried twice a week on the station, Sunday mornings at 10 and Wednesday evenings at 10. And Mae was not only the first person to talk about mind control, but was the first person also to break the Jonestown connection. And she also did a lot of work on the proposed UCLA Institute for the Study and Prevention of Violent Behavior. Now, the Layton family, as I said, is a very, very interesting bunch of people. And we're going to cover some of the connections of Lawrence Layton Sr. Now recall how involved the Laytons were with Jonestown. Larry Layton Jr. leads the Port Kaituma airstrip massacre, which kills Leo Ryan, among others. His sister is married to George Philip Blakey, the CIA agent who put down the original down payment on Jonestown, on the Guyana property down there. And the mother, Lisa Layton, is also a member of People's Temple, and the father, Lawrence Layton Sr., was a member of People's Temple and is perhaps the single most important figure in this entire story. Now, in just a second, Nip Tuck's going to read you an interesting piece of background about Lawrence Layton Sr. It's going to come from an interesting book called In My Father's House. Now, this is the story of the Layton family and the Reverend Jim Jones. It has two authors, Min S. Yee, and Thomas N. Layton, Layton, who is the son of Lawrence Layton Sr., the brother of Larry Layton Jr. Okay? And this book was published in softcover by Berkeley Books and was copyrighted in, copyrighted 1981, okay? Min Yee, Thomas Layton, In My Father's House.
Okay, now the first is a very short segment. The significance of this, at least the possible significance of this, will be explained in a moment. The family they're going to refer to is the Phillip family. Now the Phillip family, Phillip is the maiden name of Lisa Layton, the wife of Lawrence Layton Sr., the mother of Debbie Layton Blakey and Lawrence Layton Jr.
So this is the wife's family we're talking about right here, the woman who marries Dr. Lawrence Layton Sr., the father of all the Laytons, and this is the Phillip family, the maiden name of Lisa Layton.
Right. Now, the family was, at the time that they're speaking about, was living, I believe, in Hamburg, Germany, and they say financially, again, in the book In My Father's House, financially, however, the 1920s were good to the Phillip family. Again, this is the family of Larry Layton Jr.'s mother's parents. As a stockbroker, Hugo, the mother's father, represented such firms as I.G. Farben and the chemical giant Siemens and Halske. His banking business also flourished, and the family lived well. Now, in and of itself, a fairly innocuous paragraph. The interesting thing, of course, being this early connection with the I.G. Farben Chemical Combine. Those of you who have listened to some of our other Radio Free America broadcasts, the early ones on the foundations of the Cold War, or Uncle Sam and the Swastika, or some of the other shows dealing with industrialism in the Third Reich, will realize the possible significance of this. I.G. Farben was the German chemical combine that crops up all over the place in the study of post-World War II anti-communism, and even pre-World War II anti-communism, and support of fascism. The the international combine known as IG Farben, originally a chemical dye-stuff combine, later went into the makings of things such as Zyklon B nerve gas used in the execution chambers of the concentration camps, and a variety of other things that were used by the German army to fight with and by the German economy to support the German army. IG Farben also was very heavily involved with numerous Western industrial powers, such as Standard Oil, and in many cases this involvement continued right through the war, in many cases raising some doubts about the relative loyalty of the Western industrial powers that were indeed still dealing with IG Farben and were laying open their technical secrets for some rather important things during time of war, such as how to make artificial rubber and things like this, which would be of infinite value to a war effort, especially for Germany, which had no access for most of the war to rubber supplies. Now, the other interesting thing about IG Farben is that by the end of the war, when the IG Farben cartel was more or less broken up, again, as we see so often in these cases, it was not fully broken up, and many parts of it still survive today, such as the Bayer people who make Bayer aspirin, or GAF that make GAF floor tiles, and the GAF Viewmaster that Henry Fonda used to advertise. But although the combine was broken up slightly, the more interesting fact is that several of the important, I suppose the board members and the directors of IG Farben actually stood trial for war crimes, among the only civilians ever to stand trial for war crimes and be convicted. We've mentioned Otto Ambrose a great deal because he just recently came to the United States at the express behest of a personal friend of President Reagan's, also well-known industrialist who crops up in these things. But so IG Farben was very, very deeply sunken in the business of the Third Reich and was involved in all aspects of the war effort.
Not only that, but it's worth noting that IG Farben, like so many of the key German defense industries and cartels, was very much connected with American business. The Dulles Brothers law firm, the prestigious law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell, a top Wall Street law firm, handled the legal business of the American subsidiary of IG Farben. IG was a cartel, it was an international monopoly, and had profound and ongoing connections with American business, and it was part of that German-American industrial axis that we've spoken about a great deal on this broadcast, and our Uncle Sam on this station, and our Uncle Sam on the Swastika broadcast. If anybody would like to know more about that, that also is on file, and if somebody would like a copy of that program, they can contact us after the show here.
Okay, so the basic summation then, again, many of these things at this point crop up only as circumstantial ties, and it is of course up to you folks to decide whether there's anything there besides mere circumstance, but we find the mother of Larry Layton and Debbie Layton Blakey coming from a family, where the father worked actively for IG Farben. Of course, IG Farben was a big corporation, but as a big corporation, nonetheless, it still managed to get involved in a lot of nasty things, and that is the first thing to look at in terms of the Layton family.
It's also worth noting that all of the cults or alleged cults that we're going to be dealing with on this broadcast have evidentiary tributaries or connecting links to various aspects of the axis of the Japanese, German, and Italian alliance during the Second World War, and they are, well, this is one of the interesting aspects of these various cults. Their intelligence connections, their fascist connections, and overtones. These are the things we're going to be looking at the program tonight. And the German origins of Lisa Phillip, now Lisa Layton, or I guess Lisa Layton when she passed away, are not incidental. It's worth noting that Lisa was introduced to her husband, Lawrence Layton Sr., or Lawrence as we'll call him here, by the fellow who she had been dating in Germany, and the same fellow, a German fellow who had also come to the United States, introduced her, well, actually met her when she got off the boat from Germany, and then it was this same fellow who introduced her to Lawrence Layton Sr. And so it's an interesting tangle of people, and how coincidental some of this is, well, perhaps you can decide for yourselves, and if we have time for phone-ins at the end, you can perhaps comment on that. An interesting piece of background concerning Lawrence Layton Sr. and his connection to the Phillip family, or elements thereof, is also brought out in my father's house. Reading, Lawrence was preparing for his doctoral examinations when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Fearing that Lawrence would be drafted, Lisa wrote to her father's cousin, Dr. James Franck, F-R-A-N-C-K, the Nobel laureate who was now professor of physics at the University of Chicago. Dr. Franck arranged a pre-doctoral appointment in physics for Layton at Chicago. But then Layton received a student deferment, and he decided to finish his doctoral work at Pennsylvania. If he had gone to Chicago, he discovered later, he would have been working on the Manhattan Project, developing the first atomic bomb. Lisa was horrified when she first learned this. Now, remember Dr. James Franck, the cousin of Lisa Phillip, later Lisa Layton, and his role in looking for a job for Lawrence Layton. Initially, he was going to go out to Chicago, at the University of Chicago, where he would have been working on the Manhattan Project, the first atomic bomb. Remember that as you listen to the following information.
Yes, it seems that Lawrence Layton was not to avoid the atomic bomb no matter how hard he tried. Again, from my father's house, continuing, a little later on in the story, Layton was also having his troubles at work. It turned out that his boss at Kodak, Dr. Hickman, was interested in ideas that came from one source only, himself. Layton was coming up with too many suggestions that Hickman thought crossed over into his own private reserve. One sketch sheet that Layton turned in had to do with thermal diffusion in the purification of chemicals. Layton didn't know it at the time, but the Manhattan Project had already been set up, and Kodak was involved in it, using a similar process in purifying uranium isotopes at its plant in the remote town of Kingsport, Tennessee. So again, according to the book, that Layton was not aware of it, but Kodak was indeed working on the Manhattan Project, and Layton appeared to be doing some work that fairly closely paralleled some activity that Kodak was involved in for the Manhattan Project.
So remember the Manhattan Project connection. Perhaps Lawrence Layton was not working on it, or perhaps there was an aspect of the project that he was working on with or without his knowledge. It says in his book that he was not aware of the Manhattan Project. Although there's a lot of good information in the book, it is written by a member of the Layton family and is reasonably self-serving. Perhaps nothing more than an interesting coincidence, the fact that initially Lawrence Layton was to go out to Chicago, where his wife's cousin was going to get him a job on the Manhattan Project. Later he goes back east to Eastman Kodak, where he's working on, among other things, a chemical diffusion process, which was something very similar to which, if not identical to, was in fact being used on the Manhattan Project.
One of the reasons that, again, in most cases one would say, well, simply a coincidence, not only the hindsight of what later happened to the Layton family causes us to scrutinize this a little more closely, but the fact that within 5 years or so, 5 or 6 years after the end of World War II, Lawrence Layton Sr. would find himself in a very, very prominent position in a rather interesting part of the defense establishment, and later on would also find himself moved to a high position in another part of the defense establishment, and he certainly seemed to have quite a bit of clout for a young man who had been working all unawares for Kodak during World War II without having any connections to any of these people, as we will see.
Good point. Again, this is a speculative note, but very important perhaps in light of Lawrence Layton's later career, because Lawrence Layton has many, many connections which go to the innermost sanctums of the national security establishment. Perhaps his most significant appointment for our case, for our purposes here, was when he was named basically Chief of Research for the Biochemistry Branch of the Chemical Warfare Division of the U.S. Army at Dugway Proving Ground. Okay? This is mentioned in my father's house. It reads as follows. Between the Dugway Mountains and the Stansbury Range, 80 miles southwest of Salt Lake City, lies the Dugway Proving Grounds. Like more than half of Utah, the area in prehistoric times was covered by Lake Bonneville. Now the flat, dry lake bed encompasses thousands of square miles. During World War II, Dugway was the testing site for various types of incendiary weapons. Field and laboratory tests of toxic gases and chemicals were also conducted there. When Lawrence Layton arrived at Dugway in the fall of 1951, his title was Chief Biochemistry Branch Chemical Warfare Division. As the chief, he directed the work of 8 other chemists and biochemists, a team that performed toxicological and pharmacological investigations of various toxic agents and how these agents affected animals in field tests. The research team also studied the effects of various chemical warfare agents on blood and nerve enzymes. All their work was classified secret or top secret. Remember the work on people and the work studying the effects of various chemicals and toxic agents. 4 months after his arrival, Layton's responsibilities expanded greatly when he was named chief of the entire Chemical Warfare Division. By the spring of 1952, he was directing all the activities of the division, including the research, development, and testing of all chemical items and toxic agents by the division's 5 branches. analytical chemistry, biological chemistry, organic chemistry, physical chemistry, and the field test branch. According to an unclassified government report, he, quote, was responsible for the publication of 10 classified reports on research aspects of chemical warfare agents and more than 100 reports on chemical weapons systems. So this is a very, very, very important appointment for our purposes here. Perhaps ironic, too, in light of his in-laws' connections to I.G. Farben, which developed so many of the modern poison gases, including nerve gas, and it's something that should definitely be kept in mind in light of some of the information that we're going to be covering later. So again, remember the connections to the Manhattan Project as you observe the progress of Lawrence Layton up as he moves his way on up through the U.S. National Security Establishment. Here, again, chief of the entire Chemical Warfare Division. Okay, and remember his work testing chemical agents and biological warfare agents.
Okay, now, usually when people, in whatever kind of establishment, a business establishment or otherwise, they move, usually, if they move horizontally, it's usually they move to a different group of people but doing the same kind of thing, or else occasionally if they move to a new discipline they will start over again a little lower down. However, Lawrence Layton Sr. seems to have been moved to another position of extreme responsibility in a field he was not very familiar with. Reading again from In My Father's House, after almost 2 years at Dugway, Layton decided he had had enough of the proving grounds. For one thing, he could not bring himself to participate in the cliquish backbiting and politicking that went on there. He felt that the post commander was, quote, the most disgusting and arrogant and profane person I'd ever met, unquote. Layton wanted no part of the professional jealousy and paranoia of his colleagues. When a friend from Washington, D.C. visited the Dugway facility, Layton confided his unhappiness, and the friend suggested that he apply for an opening at the Naval Powder Factory, later more accurately named Propellant Facility, at Indian Head, Maryland. Layton arranged for an interview, put in for some vacation time, took a train to Washington, and was immediately offered a job as Associate Director of Research and Development. He didn't feel fully qualified for the position, but working with ballistics, rockets, ICBMs, and the new Vanguard satellite program seemed an interesting challenge. Also, he would be leaving behind the unhealthy politicking at Dugway, and his family would be happy with a move back to Maryland. Okay, so apparently the unhealthy politicking, which surrounded him despite the fact that he was basically in charge of the chemical division, drove him out of the Dugway Proving Grounds, and he managed to walk into a job as an Associate Director of Research at the Propellant Facility at Indian Head, Maryland, again, working right squarely, and this is a man who during World War II was essentially an apprentice working for Kodak, and 7, 8, 9 years after World War II, he's already become head of chemical warfare research, and then an associate director of research for ICBMs, ballistic missiles, rockets, and the Vanguard satellite program. So a man who definitely has a rising star.
Alrighty, now recall that in the first program that we dealt with Jonestown, in the second part of our series about mind control, we examined the possibility that Jonestown may have been an extension of some of the CIA and military's mind control programs. Here, what we're really asking you to consider is simply some of the contradictions in the official story of Jonestown. In particular, the official story with regard to the bodies. Initially, there were reports of there were 1,100 passports of People's Temple members who went down to Jonestown. Then about 150 to 200 of them simply vanished from the news. All of a sudden, they began talking about 900. For the first 5 days or so after the massacre, the press reports simply talked about 400 bodies. After about 5 days of looking for the other missing 500 people, no word about the 200 who were lopped off at the beginning, all of a sudden the press reported that, by golly, here were the other 500 bodies. They were under the first 400 all along, and they just hadn't noticed it. They said there were a great many children who had been murdered and were lying underneath the bodies. This in spite of the fact that the bodies had been were in the process of being turned over and identified to the extent that they could this entire time. Now this is one of the aspects of the Jonestown situation that has elicited a great deal of curiosity from people in the past. A lot of people have expressed grave reservations as to how that could possibly have happened. Now remember Lawrence Layton Sr.'s work in testing chemical and biological agents at the Dugway Proving Grounds in Utah. And think about some of the anomalies in the official story. I'd like to read you a short section now from a book called The Children of Jonestown. That was authored by Kenneth Wooden, W-O-O-D-E-N, published in softcover by McGraw-Hill and copyrighted 1981. Wooden's also the author of a very famous book about disturbed orphans and attempts to find foster homes for them called Weeping in the Playtime of Others. And Wooden did some work about the many children who were at Jonestown, and I'd like to read you a short section of that here. Wooden writes in The Children of Jonestown, "Initially, the United States and Guyana agreed that the 400 known bodies were to be buried at Jonestown. But as the body count rose day by day, so did Prime Minister Burnham's concern that his country would become a cult shrine. He told the U.S. Embassy that the dead Americans had to be removed at once. The United States military was quickly mobilized, and within several days of Dr. Moto's arrival, he was the chief medical examiner of Guyana, was on the scene to start the grim task of removing the bodies. The first chore of the troops was to bayonet the bloated bodies to release the internal gases caused by the hot sun and high humidity. The second was more controversial. Although Ordell Rhodes and Stanley Clayton had returned to the compound the first morning to help identify the dead, quote, on orders from very high up, all politically sensitive papers and forms of identification were removed from the corpses." I'm going to read that sentence again. Although Ordell Rhodes and Stanley Clayton had returned to the compound the first morning to help identify the dead, quote, on orders from very high up, all politically sensitive papers and forms of identification were removed from the corpses, unquote. Photos on the cover of Newsweek and other magazines and newspapers clearly show that many of the bodies had ID tags on them. Joel Cobb and John Stone, who are now among the unidentified children, were initially positively identified. Jim Cobb told NBC News in March of 1979, quote, my brother, Johnny Cobb, saw tags on the people's bodies and only 2 members of my family have been identified and I want to know why, unquote. Lieutenant General Gordon Sumner later was reported to have said, quote, it was the first time in his military career that he saw his men politicized, unquote. In view of the fact that the order to strip the IDs came from Robert Pastor, P-A-S-T-O-R, of the staff of Zbigniew Brzezinski, President Carter's national security advisor, it is clear that the impulse was to save any possible embarrassment to the Carter administration. This action would, in many cases, make the process of identification impossible for the medical authorities in Guyana, and once the bodies had been returned to the United States. Dr. Rudiger Breitenegger, B-R-E-I-T-E-N-E-C-K-E-R, a Baltimore pathologist, said that the 7 autopsies at which he assisted, quote, were severely hampered by lack of crucial information which is usually collected in medical legal investigations, unquote. Unaware of the stripping of the bodies and uninformed of Dr. Moto's work and findings, the United States pathologists naively told the New York Times on February 18, 1979, quote, we shuddered about the degree of ineptness, unquote. Preparing the children for removal from Jonestown to the United States was no easy task for the GIs assigned to the duty. In fact, the Army and Air Force are quietly providing psychiatric help to many of the young soldiers and airmen who assisted in the removal of the bodies from Jonestown. Well, there's a lot of things to mention in this passage I just read. First of all, why would the ID tags be cut off the bodies? In particular, why would the orders come down from a top advisor on the staff of Zbigniew Brzezinski, President Carter's national security advisor, to remove the tags from the bodies? And indeed, then, what is how can you account for the discrepancy in the casualty figures reported from Jonestown? It seems unlikely that 500 bodies could have been hidden under the first 400 all along while people were attempting to identify them. And the question is, was there any relation, this is simply speculation, was there any relationship between some of the types of work that Dr. Lawrence Layton in the past was doing and Jonestown? Were these people in any way being used for experimentation? Was this a form of covert operation? And again, remember Dr. Lawrence Layton's work testing toxins at Dugway Proving Ground. Remember the connections to I.G. Farben, and remember Dr. Lawrence Layton's many connections to various aspects of the U.S. national security establishment. Again, we're not saying that we have the absolute answer here. What we're saying is that the facts as they are given are not only don't make sense, but are in all probability impossible, and that something appears to be rotten in Denmark, and we're saying what, where, and why were the ID tags cut off.
One also wants to at least raise an eyebrow and look curiously at the Army and Air Force psychiatrists that have been brought in to help the soldiers who were involved in stripping the ID tags and so hopelessly confusing the identification that to this day, as far as I know, quite a few bodies remain unidentified from Jonestown. What kind of psychiatric help they're getting? Of course, one of the results of the stripping of of identification from these bodies and some of the other things that have gone on is that to this day nobody has been able to develop any kind of a clear picture of who was where when, which of course when you're trying to put together information on this kind of scene afterwards is the kind of thing that's vitally important to get timelines going, positioning, and to show the ebb and flow of people in and out of the Jonestown compound in the first place. So basically what has been done by the removal of those ID tags, not just to render the bodies of the people who died at Jonestown nameless, but in many cases also to so completely confuse any investigation that might go on as to make it virtually impossible to put anything concrete together.
A couple of quick points. Now remember, we've come across Zbigniew Brzezinski in the past. He is a Polish native who was a professor at Columbia University in New York. He then went on to become President Carter's national security advisor. Now, in our Radio Free America show about Reinhard Gehlen, the Nazi intelligence chief who jumped to the United States with his entire Eastern Front and organization, we took a look at the curious circumstances by which a fellow named Valerian Trifa, a Gehlen agent, a Romanian Nazi, a war criminal, came to speak over the Romanian language service of Radio Free Europe on May Day of 1979. And we took a look at the fact that his hiring by Radio Free Europe and the subsequent firing of employees who were critical of this Nazis being hired to address Romania were basically the people responsible for hiring Trifa were part of a circle of friends which included Zbigniew Brzezinski. The key names there: Noel Bernard, head of the Romanian language service, and a fellow named Paul Henze, longtime CIA operative, former colleague of Brzezinski's at Radio Free Europe, which, recall, was started by Reinhard Gehlen. We mentioned that in our Radio Free America series about Gehlen. And it's worth noting that Henze has been very active with the thesis been in publicizing the assertion that the KGB shot the Pope, which we've devoted a major block of time here on KFJC to putting it down. One last note here before we leave the People's Temple, and I would say you can probably figure at some point we'll do an entire Radio Free America show about the People's Temple, because they're tremendous. It's a tremendous issue, and we haven't covered all of it. If you think that all of our speculation about the Leighton family possibly being involved in some sort of intrigue or skullduggery is pure poppycock, take note of this particular incident in the Leighton family shortly after Lawrence Leighton received his appointment to Dugway. Again, reading from In My Father's House. On May 10th, 1952, just 2 months after Leighton was named Chief of the Chemical Warfare Division, Anita Phillip, that's the mother of Lisa Leighton, Anita Phillip committed suicide by jumping from the window of her New York apartment. The suicide note she left behind was written in German and translates roughly as follows, quote, "My friends, know that I, free and proper, am a good American, but I was a gossip and have been entangled in a network of intrigue. I no longer have the strength to free myself from it. Forget me not, my beloved children and family, and you, Hugo, forgive me." Hugo, recall, is the father of Lisa Leighton, the lawyer for I.G. Farben. "Live well. All of you loved mankind so well." She signed the note with a single letter A. She was 61 years old. So apparently somebody was noting a pattern of intrigue involving the Leighton Phillip axis sometime before. So again, if this seems a little far-fetched to you, if it seems like we're clutching at straws, well, apparently that was more than Anita Phillip had to clutch as she fell from that window. So keep that in mind.
Okay, no talk about cults and cults related to political activity would be complete without the introduction of the Reverend Sun Myung Moon and his Unification Church. Sun Myung Moon and the Unification Church, otherwise known as the Moonies to most people, have become a very prominent part of the political scene, and indeed their political influence is increasing all the time in the United States and in the Americas in general. We've talked in the past about them to a large extent. We've talked about their origins, which we'll go back over tonight to a small extent, and we've talked about many of their activities. Some of you, of course, are aware of these activities. They're very heavily involved politically in a number of Latin American countries. Their political arm, Causa, is currently getting money to the anti-Sandinista rebels and to various right-wing governments all over Central and South America to put down internal revolutionary movements and things of that nature. People in Uruguay are talking about the fact that the Moonies have $50 million invested in Uruguay and they only have 3 members in that particular country. So the Moonies have been getting around. Here in the United States, of course, they've been publishing a newspaper called the Washington Times, from which the editor, himself a staunch conservative, just recently quit because he said the paper was being too completely controlled by the Moonies. And the Washington Times is a glossy little newspaper that basically is running the arch-conservative party line and is getting nationwide distribution right now. There have been numerous other allegations of things that the Moonies have been involved in that we don't really have time to go into right now, but that's just to give you a general idea. They're very much involved with a lot of things in the political world right now.
We're going to cover some of the many bases that the Moonies touched during the course of the broadcast. Before we actually get into the Moonies themselves, it might be worth mentioning where our information, or most of the information we're talking about, we're going to present to you this evening comes. Most of the information we're going to present about the Unification Church comes from a great book called Gifts of Deceit, subtitled Sun Myung Moon, Tongsun Park, and the Korean Scandal. It was authored by Robert Boettcher, or Boettger, B-O-E-T-T-C-H-E-R, with Gordon L. Friedman, F-R-E-E-D-M-A-N. Let me read you a little bit about Mr. Boettcher. As staff director of the House Subcommittee on Internal Relations, Robert Boettcher was in on the Korean Scandal from the beginning. It was the investigations done by his staff that led directly to the breaking of that scandal. His work put him in liaison with top officials in the CIA and in the Departments of State and Justice, as well as with Special Counsel Leon Jaworski and the staff and principals of the Ethics Committee investigation. Fluent in 2 Far Eastern languages and with an MS in International Relations from Georgetown University, Mr. Boettcher served 5 years as a Foreign Service officer with a specialty in Far Eastern affairs before joining Congressman Donald Fraser's staff in 1971. So that's the source of our information. Gifts of Deceit, published in hardcover by Holt, Reinhardt, and Winston, copyrighted 1980. And we'll tell you a little bit about what happened to Mr. Beecher after he wrote the book, after we've talked about People's Temple.
Okay, starting with some information about what it is that Sun Myung Moon believes, or at least what he professes to believe as he leads his church.
Now, remember, as you're listening to what the Moonies actually think, just remember all the people selling the flowers along the El Camino and all the places you run into the Moonies, and they may look real nice smiling and waving these flowers around. Consider, as you listen to the stuff that Nip and I are about to read you, consider what the Moonies actually believe.
And also, again, don't get so caught up in the mythology of the thing as to forget that these people are taking a very active political role, whether or not their particular religion is the source of it, or there are direct political motives that the religion is a cover-up for. Again, that's a question that we're not capable of answering tonight, but anyway, you will have some more information we hope to make that decision with. Again, from Gifts of Deceit, this is the beginning of a chapter, and the chapter is entitled The Lord of the Second Advent. Sun Myung Moon leaves no room for doubt about where he and Korea stand in the eyes of God. He is the new Messiah, and Korea is God's chosen nation. This is the culmination of God's 6,000-year quest to restore man from the fall of Adam. It was revealed to him by God when he was a young man, Moon tells his cult followers. God said, quote, "You are the son I have been seeking, the one who can begin my eternal history." Moon felt no humility. After all, it was God's will to choose him after an exhaustive search through thousands of years and billions of lives. The title, Son of God, could go to only the rarest of individuals, he says, one capable of winning victory over all human history. He was proud to inherit God's kingdom. Moon's theology, the divine principle, teaches that man can be restored to original goodness by restoring Adam, Eve, and 3 archangels. Adam's fall resulted from Eve's being seduced by the archangel Lucifer, who was jealous because God gave Eve to Adam instead of to him. Human history has been a constant replay of the same interaction among Adams, Eves, and archangels. God's eternal plan for man's perfection has been thwarted, as potential Adams are undone by Eves and archangels. The positions of Adam, Eve, and the archangels are occupied by persons, nations, and movements identified as such by Moon. Ultimately, Adam must dominate after successfully going through 3 stages: formation, growth, and perfection. But if an Eve or an archangel is at a higher stage than Adam, they must help restore Adam to perfection so he can assume his rightful role in the unified system of things. Moon is perfect Adam, so he must be obeyed without question. Jesus, the most important Adam between the original one and Moon, attained spiritual perfection, but was a flawed Messiah. His mission was foredoomed by John the Baptist, who spent his time baptizing people instead of becoming Jesus' obedient disciple for influencing the politics of the Herod regime. Just to insert again, since we're getting into this very deeply, just to remind you folks, this is somebody else's theology we're reading. This is the theology of the Unification Church as laid out by Sun Myung Moon, just in case anybody's just turning the radio on. Also note that last phrase. He claims that Jesus' messiahhood was flawed because he let John the Baptist baptize people instead of helping him to influence the politics of the Herod regime. Making things worse, Jesus was a child of adultery, not immaculate conception, according to Moon. Mary was impregnated by Zachariah. Jesus had an unhappy home life because Joseph was jealous of Zachariah and resented Jesus. The divine principle, therefore, teaches family unity as dictated by Moon. When Jesus grew up, he failed as a leader because he was unable to love his disciples enough to motivate them to kill for him or die in his place. Moonies are taught that because Moon's love is not of the weak Jesus kind, their love for Moon must be strong enough to do what Jesus' disciples were unprepared to do. Since Jesus was incapable of perfect love, owing to his unwholesome upbringing, he was also unable to marry, as intended by God. Quote, "The reason why Jesus died was because he couldn't have a bride. Because there was no preparation of bride to receive Jesus, that was the cause of his death," Moon preaches. Political action is central to Moon's mission, although the cult denies that it engages in politics at all. Moon views Jesus' failure as a political failure for not gaining control of the government of Israel. Jesus was able to establish a spiritual kingdom, but that was only half of what God wanted. Moon is taking up where Jesus left off by uniting the spiritual kingdom with a physical kingdom on earth. The trouble with Christians, he says, is that they have accepted the myth that the Messiah will return as a spirit, quote, on the clouds. To Moon, it is obvious that if this were true, God would have made it happen long ago. The long delay was necessary because God intended for the Lord of the Second Advent to appear as a person who will complete Jesus' mission on earth among the living. He sees Christian churches as furthering Satan's cause by rejecting him.
Continuing with gifts of deceit. Israel was God's chosen nation, but the Jews, falling prey to Satan's power, rejected Jesus. God punished them with centuries of suffering and finally cleansed them by killing 6 million in World War II. Note that interesting interpretation of the Holocaust. But the Jews had missed their chance. God had to find a new Messiah and a new Adam nation because, Moon explains, it is God's principle not to use the same people in the same territory twice. Korea was ideally suited for several reasons. It is a peninsula physically resembling the male. Like the Italian peninsula, cultures of islands and continents can mingle there to form a unified civilization corresponding to the Roman Empire. Korea had maintained its own cultural identity through invasions by China and Japan over the centuries, and at Panmunjom, the military demarcation line represents the division not only between the communist and non-communist worlds, but God and Satan as well. Japan is in the position of Eve. Being only an island country, it cannot be Adam. It yearns for male-like peninsular Korea on the mainland. Moon sees the Japanese generally as effeminate people who want to be dominated by stronger, manly powers. But as Eve prevailed over Adam in the fall, Japan prevailed over Korea in the colonial period. And like Eve in the fall, Japan became a satanic power. America is an archangel country. Its mother is England, another island country in the position of Eve. The Archangel America helped the Atom country Korea by sending Christian missionaries, rescuing it from Japanese rule and stopping the advance of Satan's atom, communist North Korea. America is too arrogant and individualistic, however. It cannot remain the world's leader because God has destined America to serve Korea. Korea's mission, therefore, is to restore the Eve country Japan and the Archangel America and become the center of the new unified world civilization. This is to be accomplished through Moon and his unification church. In Moon's unification thought, politics cannot be separated from religion. His political views have been conditioned narrowly by South Korea's two prevailing political phenomena during his lifetime: nationalism and anti-communism. What he sees as politically imperative for Korea, he has applied to all of God's universe. World history is now centered on Korea, he preaches, and what happens to Korea centers on him. He claims the Korean War could have been avoided had he been accepted as the Lord of the Second Advent. The Archangel America had created the right conditions by making Korea independent from the Eve country Japan. But the Koreans, failing to rally around Moon, were divided between communist and free world forces. Though tragic, the division carried forward God's plan that Korea be the flag bearer for the world. The battlefield for the showdown between God and Satan would be Korea. God's chosen people would triumph through suffering. America, Japan, and all other nations could be restored by helping Korea's anti-communist cause. Only in Korea could the civilizations of East and West be unified. In the end, Moon declares, even North Korea's Kim Il-sung could be restored if he answered the call to follow the divine principle. Details about Moon's early life. Now, note Moon's beginnings here before we proceed into this. Details about Moon's early life are not clear because of his efforts to tell the story himself only in terms of being the son of God. He was born in 1920 in North Korea. He was raised as a Presbyterian in a middle-class family and was a good student and studied engineering at a university in Japan during World War II. So Moon is in Japan during the Second World War. He was married in 1944 and divorced in 1950. He was arrested twice by the communist government in North Korea for activities as an evangelist and was sentenced to 5 years in prison in the fall of 1947. During the Korean War, when the United Nations forces reached Hungnam prison, he was released halfway through his sentence. He resumed his evangelical activities in Busan on the southeastern coast. With a small handful of followers in Seoul, he founded the Holy Spirit Association for the Unification of World Christianity, which became known as the Unification Church in 1954. So remember that Reverend Moon is in Japan during World War II, when of course the United States is fighting Japan. Recall also that Korea was a Japanese colony. It had originally been a Russian colony. However, after the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, Japan assumed stewardship over Korea, which she held until the end of the Second World War in 1945.
Just want to mention also that you're listening to KFJC, Los Altos Hills. A couple of other points to be made very quickly also for those who are familiar with the history of the time. They will be aware that that in Korea the
would triumph through suffering. America, Japan, and all other nations could be restored by helping Korea's anti-communist cause. Only in Korea could the civilizations of East and West be unified. In the end, Moon declares, even North Korea's Kim Il-sung could be restored if he answered the call to follow the divine principle. Details about Moon's early life. Now, note Moon's beginnings here before we proceed into this. Details about Moon's early life are not clear because of his efforts to tell the story himself only in terms of being the son of God. He was born in 1920 in North Korea. He was raised as a Presbyterian in a middle-class family and was a good student and studied engineering at a university in Japan during World War II. So Moon is in Japan during the Second World War. He was married in 1944 and divorced in 1950. He was arrested twice by the communist government in North Korea for activities as an evangelist and was sentenced to 5 years in prison in the fall of 1947. During the Korean War, when the United Nations forces reached Hungnam prison, he was released halfway through his sentence. He resumed his evangelical activities in Busan on the southeastern coast. With a small handful of followers in Seoul, he founded the Holy Spirit Association for the Unification of World Christianity, which became known as the Unification Church in 1954. So remember that Reverend Moon is in Japan during World War II, when, of course, the United States is fighting Japan. Recall also that Korea was a Japanese colony. It had originally been a Russian colony. However, after the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, Japan assumed stewardship over Korea, which she held until the end of the Second World War in 1945.
A couple of other points to be made very quickly. Also, for those who are familiar with the history of the time, they will be aware that that in Korea, the common view of Japan was not a very high one. As a matter of fact, the Japanese were absolutely hated in Korea because during the time of Japanese militarism, the Koreans were treated extremely badly by the Japanese occupying forces. In light of this, it's rather interesting that Sun Myung Moon should go off to Japan to study engineering at a university there during World War II, and should come away with a view of Japan that it is part of the divine plan to help Korea, and in fact that for somebody who winds up in a fascist country that's oppressing his country, it's rather interesting that he winds up more on the side of the fascists than the communists. Okay, and of course, as noted before, the absolute and inescapable logic of Sun Myung Moon as far as the coming world cataclysm of which Korea will be the focus. Nonetheless, whether you're inclined to scoff at this sort of thing or not, this is a multi-million, probably now getting close to being a multi-billion-dollar operation worldwide, having a very profound effect on politics in many places right here on our own continent. And they are firmly convinced that it is going to come down to an Armageddon battle between communism and Christianity, of which they are going to be the leaders, so one would assume at least that they are doing their best to try and make sure that event happens.
And note also the tremendous egomania and the tremendous cult of personality that we have both with the Unification Church and with Jonestown. Notice how a single individual leader assumes total dominance over all aspects of cultural, intellectual, and political life of the cult. I mean, it's with Jonestown you have Jim Jones, Jim Jones, Jim Jones, Jim Jones. With the Unification Church you have Moon, 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 Moon. Remember that. Remember, and of course, in the context of all of these broadcasts on Radio Free America, we talk about fascism. Consider the totalitarian and fascistic aspects of these cults as we talk about them. So talking now about the fascistic dynamics within the cult society itself, not just their overt political views. And the overt political views are also obviously front and center, particularly with the Unification Church. And again, as we talk about the political history of the Unification Church, remember that Korea was a Japanese colony when the United States was fighting Imperial Japan during World War II.
Also, bear in mind a trend or a pattern that we've seen so many times, and that, of course, listeners to Radio Free America are going to be so aware of, which are the United States or the Allied powers moving in to liberate a country from fascism out of apparently total fear of communism, instead of actually allowing the people who, in many cases, Korea was fairly well subjugated, but in most other cases, the people actually fighting and organized to combat the fascist dominators of the country, who are usually socialists or communists, or at least progressive partisans. In many cases, they're actually just plain old, middle-of-the-road people who want their country back, are barred from office by the Allies as they move through. And in fact, we see reactionaries, and in some cases, people who actively supported the self-same fascists, being put back into power again. And of course, in Korea, because of the involvement of the Korean government, as we will see with the Unification Church, this is also an important factor and something to note, going along with gifts of deceit. Korea's liberation from Japan in 1945 was a tarnished triumph. The country was divided in half between a communist North and a non-communist South. Korea was again a pawn of the big powers, this time the Soviet Union and the United States. The Russians, accepting the surrender of Japanese forces north of the 38th parallel, set up a communist government there as they had done in East Germany. In the South, the American occupation authorities arrived knowing nothing about Korea. At first, they relied on the Japanese for help, and then later turned to Koreans who had collaborated with Japan. Korean Democrats were assumed to be too far to the left. To lead the new free South Korea, the Americans brought in Syngman Rhee, a reactionary politician who had spent the previous 35 years in the United States. Since Ri had no power base of his own in Korea, Koreans formerly with the Japanese colonial administration formed the backbone of his regime. Funds to support him were given largely by those who had made money under the Japanese. Again, as mentioned before, a complete reestablishment of the Japanese colonial, basically fascist, militarist, whatever you want to call it, bureaucracy. In 1946, Park Chung-hee was admitted to South Korea's new military academy. We're going to be following Park and some of these other folks. One of the cadets entering in 1948 was Kim Jong-pil, who later married Park's niece. In 1961, he would help Park take over the country. He would also establish the Korean CIA, organize Park's political party, and see that the Park regime gave its blessing to the activities of Sun Myung-moon's Unification Church.
All right, so again, we can't emphasize too strongly that when the United States assumed the stewardship of Korea from Japan, whom it had defeated in the Second World War, basically the entire fascist Japanese colonial infrastructure was, at least for an interim period, returned to power in Korea to administer the takeover, the transition from Japanese to American rule. And many key Japanese fascists, if you will, or bureaucrats from the colonial Japanese administration, moved up into various aspects of the U.S. national security operations in the Pacific. And specifically, we're going to talk about a Japanese war criminal who became very, very influential with the Moonies and with the Lockheed Corporation, a lot of other things a little later in the broadcast. But what we're talking about here, folks, is the people we were fighting in World War II. Again, this over in the Pacific theater now, become agents of American policy after the war. The very people who bombed Pearl Harbor are then the recipients of large amounts of American capital, and also they become the protégés of the United States and administer American policy in the Pacific. And that is the bottom line with the Unification Church, are the very people who we fought against in World War II, just as the Galen Organization was brought in at the end of World War II. The Unification Church involves Japanese fascists, the folks who bombed Pearl Harbor. So that's really the bottom line here, what we're talking about with the Unification Church. Now, some of the key people in the Moonies, in the Unification Church, are very close to the Korean CIA. Now, the Korean CIA is very, very close to the American CIA, works hand in glove with it, and it is worth noting here the presence of the Korean CIA agents in very, very influential positions in the Unification Church. Also worth noting how these agents' presence in the Unification Church results in the elevation of the Unification Church to essentially nothing more or less than an official wing or an official organ of South Korean policy. Again, going back to Gifts of Deceit by Robert Beecher. Speaking of Moon, 4 of his early followers were young army officers close to Kim Jong-pil, the chief planner for the Park regime and founding director of the KCIA. Kim Song-in, his last name is like Sang-in, S-A-N-G-I-N, also called Steve Kim, K-I-M, his interpreter, later to become KCIA station chief in Mexico City. Han Song-kuk, S-A-N-G-K-E-U-K, Bud Han, who became ambassador to Norway, Han Song-kil, K-I-L, who became Moon's personal secretary after serving at the Korean embassy in Washington, and Bo Hee Pak, Moon's advance man in Washington during and after Pak's service as assistant military attaché at the Korean embassy. So Kim Jong-pil is not only head of the Korean CIA, but is sort of like the right-hand man and chief executor of Park Chung-hee's policy in Korea. He becomes a key Moonie protege, so basically protector, I should say, and he founds the KCIA. A top KCIA official, Bo Hee Pak, as well as these other fellows, Kim Song-in, Han Song-kuk, and Han Song-kil, become key Moonie officials. Continuing with Gifts of Deceit. Kim Jong-pil made a 2-week official visit to the United States as KCIA director in the fall of 1962. Included in his entourage was Steve Kim as interpreter. The Korean embassy mobilized for the occasion, and the Kennedy administration rolled out the red carpet. Lieutenant Colonel Bo Hee Pak was the embassy's officer in charge for Kim's meetings with CIA Director John McCone, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, and Defense Intelligence Agency Head Lieutenant General J.E. Carroll. En route home, Kim Jong-pil met secretly in his room at the St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco with a small group of Moon's early activists who had been sent to proselytize on the West Coast and some American converts. Kim Jong-un, Y-O-U-N-G-O-O-N, beginning in Eugene, Oregon in 1959, had moved to Berkeley, California. Choi Song-ik, S-A-N-G-I-K, having established a church in Japan, had moved to San Francisco. Kim told them he sympathized with Moon's goals and promised to help the Unification Church with political support from inside the government. He said he could not afford to do so openly, however, which fit Moon's plans perfectly. Kim Jong-pil had learned from Moon's followers in the KCIA that Moon was a zealous anti-communist. Interrupting the narrative here, recall Kim Jong-pil is South Korean President Park Chung-hee's right-hand man, both Kim Jong-pil and Park Chung-hee having been Japanese military cadets when Japan was at war with the U.S. Kim Jong-pil had learned from Moon's followers in the KCIA that Moon was a zealous anti-communist. That could be useful to the government. He was also aware of Moon's ambition to build influence in Korea and beyond. That could create problems for the government if the influence were not properly channeled. Moon was anxious to increase church membership in cities and villages throughout the country. Fine, thought Kim, just as long as they don't get out of bounds. The KCIA must be the one calling the shots. He decided the Unification Church should be organized satisfactorily to be utilized as a political tool whenever he and the KCIA needed it. Organizing and utilizing the Unification Church would be a simple matter anyhow. After the military coup overthrew the elected government in 1961, all organizations in Korea were required to apply for re-registration with the government. Undesirable elements were identified through a process of re-evaluation and dealt with accordingly. Kim could maintain effective ties with Moon's organization through the 4 Army officers, but the Moonies had best not be told of Kim's plans to manipulate them. It was a situation favorable both to Moon's plans for expanding via the good graces of the government and to Kim Jong-pil's plans for building a personal power base. Before Nip Tuck continues reading here, so remember, the key link-ups between the Moonie leadership and the Korean CIA and the eventual decision by Kim Jong-pil, right-hand man for the South Korean president, to, in essence, co-opt the Unification Church and to turn it into nothing more or less than an organ of the Korean CIA. So that's what we're talking about here. And recall again, the South Korean national security establishment's antecedents with imperial fascist Japan.
Okay, continuing with Gifts of Deceit. Bohee Pak's work for Moon in America was of crucial importance. Pak is a model Moonie. For him, master always comes first. From the time he joined Moon in 1957, he endeavored to make everything he did contribute in some way to Moon's divine mission. Assignment to the embassy in Washington in 1961 was a precious opportunity to do missionary work in the United States. As a diplomat, he could foster Moon's interest within the ROK government, that's the Korean government, and keep Moon apprised of important intelligence. It was God's providence that he go to America, he believed, and he must make the most of it. Pak witnessed tirelessly for Moon. Every new acquaintance was a potential convert. His home on North Utah Street in Arlington, Virginia was a recruiting center. Every social gathering there was a potential study group. He was assisted in his ministry by his wife and another Moonie living with him, Jun Ri, who later became well known as the owner of a chain of Korean karate schools. In 1963, Pak established the Unification Church in Virginia. The incorporation papers declared the church to be totally independent from any other organization and affiliated with the original movement in Korea only on a doctrinal basis. Airline pilot Robert Rowland and his wife were cultivated patiently by Pak over a period of several months without a hint about the connection with Moon. The Rowlands and the Paks became close friends. On one occasion, Rowland asked what the duties of an assistant military attaché were. Pak was candid about his intelligence role at the embassy. He explained that in addition to routine diplomatic work, he was responsible for liaison between South Korean and American intelligence agencies, which often required his visiting the super-secret National Security Agency, NSA, located at Fort Meade, Maryland. Rowland asked about the work the NSA did. Pak volunteered that it dealt mainly with secret codes and monitoring of radio transmissions. Roland, a bit startled by the information, was finding his new friend to be an intriguing person.
So, as we begin to develop the history of the Unification Church, note all of the powerful interests and organizations and people that connect up with the Unification Church, that do its bidding in one capacity or another, or allow their names to be used in order to lend prestige to the American activities of the Unification Church. Here we have Bohi Pak, the fellow who runs the Mooney news organizations, hooking up with the National Security Agency. Recall that the KCIA, of which the Unification Church is essentially an organ, is very close to and works very closely with the American CIA. A key organization to understand in dealing with the Moonies is something called the KCFF, the Korean Cultural and Freedom Foundation. This also is a Bohi Pak creation, and the KCFF, the Korean Cultural and Freedom Foundation, has some very interesting names connected with it, and we're going to talk about those in just a second. Going back to Gifts of Deceit by Robert Beecher. Pak hit upon the idea of an American-based foundation to sponsor not only the Little Angels, interrupting, that's a group of girl singers, of children's singers for the Moonies. Pak hit upon the idea of an American-based foundation to sponsor not only the Little Angels, but other moon projects as well. The foundation should have broad-based appeal, so it could not be identified openly with the Unification Church. Promoting people-to-people relations with Korea and opposing communism seemed lucrative themes. Americans would contribute money to those causes, especially if recommended by distinguished leaders. Unknowingly, they would be serving Moon, but in the long run they would be rewarded by Moon's establishing the kingdom of heaven on earth. Thus was born the Korean Cultural and Freedom Foundation, the KCFF, in 1964. Unlike some other front groups, the KCFF acknowledged no affiliation with Moon. Bohi Pak would pretend his practice of Moon's religion and his work for KCFF were unrelated. Moon's founding of the Little Angels would be downplayed so that Pak and the KCFF could get the maximum advantage of appearing independently successful. However, KCFF money would be used to help make the Unification Church strong in America. The foundation would require more of Pak's time than was allowed by moonlighting. He could no longer afford to waste his workdays at the embassy. His position there had opened the right doors in Washington, but had outlived its usefulness. The moment it arrived to start working full-time for Master. Master, of course, is Moon. With the church's government connections in Seoul, he arranged for early retirement from the Army. Although now a private citizen, he was able to return to the United States on a diplomatic visa backed by a letter from the Ministry of National Defense saying he was performing an unspecified special diplomatic mission. The key to successful fundraising and propaganda was endorsement by influential people. It was essential, therefore, to have the right names in the top positions, although Pak would see to it that he alone ran the foundation. He found a useful figurehead in the person of Yang Yu-chan, Y-O-U-C-H-N, Republic of Korea Ambassador to the United States during the Korean War. Retired and settled in Washington, Yang was known and respected by American government leaders from the 50s and still carried the title of Ambassador at Large. He was especially noted for his staunch anti-communism. Yang agreed to be executive vice president and persuaded retired Admiral Arleigh Burke to accept the presidency. Bohi Pak was vice president. Burke and Yang gathered an impressive list of names for the KCFF letterhead. Former Presidents Truman and Eisenhower as honorary presidents. Kim Jong-pil as honorary chairman. The directors and advisors included Richard Nixon, George Meany, Pearl Mesta, Senator Hugh Scott, Senator Homer Capehart, General Matthew Ridgway, and Congressman Clement Zablocki. So here we have three former U.S. presidents lending their names to basically a Mooney front and lending their prestige to Moon's fundraising activities. And recall again the Japanese fascist origins of the Moonies. So here the KCFF, a very important Moon organization, and we're going to see a lot of very powerful interests and people connected to the Moonies and their activities worldwide.
Now, Gifts of Deceit goes on, among other things, to explain some of the other things that the KCFF and the Moonies got involved in, among them an early really a predecessor of the newspaper that they're involved with now. The predecessor was called the News World, published in New York, and again, masked as a non-Mooney project, but actually staffed by Moonies on the editorial staff, and definitely focused against Mooney enemies, accusing congressmen of being Soviet agents, things of that nature. Anyway, going on with Gifts of Deceit. Besides newspapers, Moon's media business included movies. He told the cult in 1974 he was forming a movie company in Japan. He was looking for the right script for a film on the life of Jesus, but was open to other subjects also. He could produce films to serve his unified three-pronged purpose: religious propaganda, political propaganda, and business profit. Mitsuharu Ishii, a Japanese Mooney, became president of One Way Production, with offices in Tokyo and Los Angeles. One Way's main project was to make an anti-communist war spectacle on General MacArthur's landing at Incheon in the Korean War. Money and actors were to come from Korea, Japan, and the United States. At Times Square in July 1979, New Yorkers were treated to neon lights advertising The News World, that's the newspaper previously mentioned, and a movie being filmed in Korea, Incheon, starring Laurence Olivier, Jacqueline Bisset, Ben Gazzara, David Jansen, and Toshiro Mifune. Moon's drive to dominate the American fishing industry was perhaps his most ambitious business undertaking. International Oceanic Enterprises was incorporated in Virginia in November 1976, along with a subsidiary, International Seafood Corporation, located in Norfolk. Bo Hee Pak was president. The company engaged in operating fishing boats and processing and selling seafood products. With the Unification Church International pumping millions into the business, International Seafood was able, within a few weeks of its incorporation, to disperse monies to the other components of the Moon organization, including $200,000 to Tong Eel Enterprises and $400,000 to U.S. Marine Corporation for buying 700 acres of waterfront property in Bayou-le-Batre, Alabama. U.S. Marine Corporation was yet another Mooney concern. Its shipbuilding affiliate was appropriately named A. Master Marine. In Richmond, Virginia, housewives could buy fresh seafood at a store named Father's Fish. Moon's fishing and seafood tentacles spread to San Francisco, Gloucester, Massachusetts. I don't know if that's how they pronounce it in Massachusetts. In England, it's Gloucester. And Kodiak, Alaska. He had a built-in competitive advantage: abundant capital flow from church sources and negligible labor costs using cult manpower. He envisioned a food crisis in the future when the world would come begging to him.
So take a look at Moon's activities here. We have him not only running newspapers, but becoming a very, very successful and large-scale business entrepreneur, becoming one of the major factors in the American fishing industry. Okay? Not only is Moon involved with fish, but also with guns as well, specifically the M16, the standard shoulder arm of the American and South Korean armies. Continuing with Gifts of Deceit. Making and selling M16 rifles made sense both economically and politically. In public, Moon and the cult denied being involved with the M16, the basic infantry weapon of the South Korean Army. Moon conceded to Newsweek magazine that Tong Eel Industries produced armaments for the Korean government, but would not say which weapons, claiming the information was classified by his government. However, information from the U.S. State Department and American and Korean businessmen in the arms field shows that Tong Eel Industries, that's T-O-N-G, second word is I-L, Tong Eel Industries makes parts for the Vulcan anti-aircraft gun, the M79 grenade launcher, the M60 machine gun, and the M16 rifle. One American businessman was shown the machinery used to make the weapons during a tour of Tong Eel's plant near Busan. H.P. Stone, vice president of Colt Industries of Hartford, Connecticut, learned how close the operational ties are between Moon and the Park regime. His experience left the impression that with respect to the M16 rifle, the Moon organization and the Korean government were one and the same. Colt holds the patent for the M16 and has a co-production agreement with the Republic of Korea government approved by the American government. The agreement allows the Republic of Korea Ministry of National Defense to make the rifle in Korea for the ROK Army. Stone got a letter from Tong Eel Industries in September of 1977 asking for approval for Tong Eel to produce the M16 for export. Stone answered in the negative, saying his company did not have authority to approve, and he was certain the U.S. government would be against the Koreans exporting the rifles. In October, Stone cabled the Ministry of National Defense on another matter. Since the U.S. State Department had approved Korea's request to make another 300,000 M16s, Stone offered the ministry a new extended contract. For several weeks, there was no reply. Then, to his surprise, an answer came not from the Korean government, but from Tong-il Industries. Tong-il said it would send representatives to Hartford in December to discuss the extension of the M16 production contract. The discussions took place as scheduled, with the president of Tong-il, Moon Sung-kyun, Master's cousin, negotiating for a contract between the Republic of Korea government and Colt Industries. When Stone asked if Tong-il was formally representing the Korean government, Moon Sung-kyun smiled and said, quote, "If you ask the Ministry of National Defense, they will say no." So basically, Moon produces the M16s for the South Korean government, was seeking permission for exporting these rifles abroad. Again, an interesting fellow, an interesting series of activities for a fellow whose roots go back to fascist Japan to be doing. And again, this not only in conjunction with, but perhaps to at least to a considerable extent at the behest of and on behalf of the U.S. government. And we're going to see many, many more activities and many more powerful and influential organizations and people hooked up with this organization.
Okay, Gifts of Deceit goes on to describe some of the activities on the part of certain members of Congress trying to get some contacts, trying to get some information out of about the Moonies and some of their involvement, including Congressman Fraser's attempt to subpoena Sun Myung Moon to appear and answer questions in front of a congressional committee, and Sun Myung Moon skips the country in May of 1978, out of the United States to London. Going on with the book, it says, Fraser was not the only one closing in on the Moonies. The Korean Cultural and Freedom Foundation had been barred from soliciting contributions in New York after 1976. The State Social Welfare Board had discovered that less than 7% of the funds collected by KCFF for the Children's Relief Fund could have been used for that purpose. The public was told that the money was urgently needed to save the lives of 350,000 children who were facing, quote, terminal forms of malnutrition in Southeast Asia. Contributions were to be used to buy emergency supplies of blood, plasma, and food. The Children's Relief Fund appears to have been more an exercise in image building than a drive to raise funds for the cult's coffers. An audit showed that Bo Hee Pak himself got $26,000 each year, while the bulk of contributions, in 1975, $920,000, was paid to the Richard A. Viguerie Company, a professional fundraising firm for handling the mail solicitations. We'll get back to that in a moment. Another $58,000 went to the Associated Public Relations Council of Washington, owned by Donald Miller, who was also the executive director of KCFF. Richard Viguerie, of course, for those of you who are not familiar, is known as the direct mail wizard. He is the man who basically has been spearheading the conservative political action committees in this country since 1980. A man of extremely right-wing views himself, a man who thinks that Ronald Reagan has been pulled to the left and needs to be brought back to the right again. And Mr. Viguerie has turned up in a number of these areas, including, I think, the other day when Ed Meese was up for his first nomination as Attorney General. Richard Viguerie suggested that Howard Metzenbaum of Ohio, who was asking a lot of questions about Ed Meese's background and his fitness as the potential Attorney General, Richard Viguerie suggested that Howard Metzenbaum was a Stalinist. So Viguerie, as you can see, is no blushing violet of a leftist himself, and that's where a lot of the money went from this particular KCFF project. Now
notice that the KCFF, the Korean Cultural and Freedom Foundation, on whose behalf former Presidents Truman, Eisenhower, and Nixon were willing to work, here winds up channeling money originally destined for relief for Southeast Asian refugee children, and it winds up going to one of the leading stars on the horizon of the far right. Okay, Richard Viguerie, one of the top people among the political action committees of the far right, and it's worth noting the connections between the Unification Church and the Nixon presidency here, because we're going to take a look at the intersection between the Nixon presidency and the Moonies, and specifically the Moonies' involvement with the Watergate Scandal and with some of the people and elements coming out of the Watergate Scandal. Returning to Gifts of Deceit. As Moon saw it, He was organizing and utilizing the Republic of Korea government, not the other way around. The government officials indoctrinated at his school would be led to the divine principle by way of anti-communism. Building military hardware under government contract would make the government dependent on him while providing funds for him to expand worldwide. The government was indebted to him for the cultural propaganda he had generated through his Little Angels. Recall, that's that Moon singing group. If he could save Nixon, save Nixon during the Watergate crisis, if he could save Nixon, his power would overshadow Park Chung-hee, and ruling the Atom country would be only a step away. He could assume his rightful position. He reminded the cult that what he was doing in Project Watergate was far more significant for its impact in Korea than in the United States. On Capitol Hill, Project Watergate brought some early results. In January of 1974, a two-day lobbying blitz for signatures on Moon's Watergate Declaration yielded about 100 congressmen and some 10 senators. The lobbyists concealed their affiliation with the Unification Church from legislators. Several months later, anti-impeachment leader Rabbi Korff, K-O-R-F-F, and Nixon aide Bruce Hershenson appealed for another Mooney display of mass support for Nixon. They valued Moon's help because he could mobilize large numbers of people anywhere on short notice and with good results. Moon was cool to the request. He said no. Korff and Hershenson asked again and again, but Moon kept turning them down. The Lord of the Second Advent wanted homage from the president. Nixon should repent to Moon for his failure of leadership, then Moon would rally the troops. Salonen was caught awkwardly in the middle. He had no decision-making power. All he could do was transmit messages back and forth between the White House and Moon's Korean-Japanese Adam Eve hierarchy. Korff and Hershenson offered no possibility of Nixon's kneeling before Moon. Ultimately, Moon decided to hold a 3-day fast on the Capitol steps, independent of White House appeals, he insisted. It was July of 1974. Things were grim for Nixon. It was time for a miracle. If anyone could deliver, Moon said, it was he. Chris Elkins helped staff the fast on the Capitol steps. Placards and posters were designed. Literature was prepared and distributed. A press corps was set up. They hoped to get Nixon to address the fasters in person. 600 Moonies were shipped to Washington to do the fasting and praying. That number was chosen so as to have each Mooney pray for one senator, congressman, and cabinet member, with Salonen and his wife taking President and Mrs. Nixon. They prayed for releasing God's power to turn the heart of America toward forgiveness for Nixon. Nixon did not appear. He sent a telegram instead. At the end of the third day, Moon came accompanied by Rabbi Korff. He addressed the fasters, telling them they had completed their mission successfully. It was the only time Chris Elkins ever heard Father bestowing full approval on his followers. So, the Moonies are lobbying on behalf of Richard Nixon during the last stages of Watergate. Apparently, according to Mr. Beecher, the main goal was not even to save Richard Nixon, but in order to save Richard Nixon as a vehicle for prestige for Reverend Moon so that he could become the head of state of the Republic of Korea, okay? But keep in mind the involvement with Richard Nixon, with the Korean Cultural and Freedom Foundation, and that organization's involvement with Richard Viguerie. Keep in mind the involvement of the Moonies with Watergate, because a number of different people and elements from the Watergate scandal are going to crop up later in connection with the Moonies. Worth noting, too, we're not going to get into the real meat of the Koreagate scandal here. It's a complex scandal. Suffice it to say that it grew out of Richard Nixon's so-called Guam Doctrine, which in the early years of the Nixon presidency called for the United States to build up anti-communist governments around the world and allow them to sort of fight in place of American troops. Recall that the U.S. was at that point winding out of Vietnam. Using the Guam Doctrine, the Unification Church and the Korean government were able to make considerable inroads in the United States and gain approval of the federal government. And in order to influence the American government in such a way as to pass legislation and generally make rulings favorable to the commercial and military interests of the Republic of Korea, of South Korea, a huge lobbying organization was set up. The two main prongs of this were the Unification Church proper and a Korean businessman named Tongsin Park, who was very closely affiliated with the Moonies, and he was sort of the other main prong of the Korean lobbying interests in this country, seeking to turn American policy in such a way as to further Nixon's Guam doctrine vis-a-vis Korea. And some of the key names to take note, it was Speaker of the House Carl Albert was one of the people who was compromised by the Moonies and sort of wound up in Moon's camp. This is significant for our purposes, that this is covered at length in Gifts of Deceit. Significant for our purposes because Carl Albert is in the line of presidential succession, and that could have played a very important part had the impeachment proceedings in Watergate proceeded.
Yes, especially since Spiro Agnew had just been forced out, too, at that time. Okay, back to the subject of the ongoing investigation of Congressman Fraser into the Moonies and into the labyrinth of the Unification Church. Just a short section here to show some more interesting folks the Moonies got hooked up with. Again, they're talking about Fraser. Congressman Fraser this time is battling an absolute blizzard of slanderous attacks from the Moonies because he was pursuing their organization. Basically, the Moonies bringing in all of their friends and everybody that they had contact with, slandering Fraser's wife and family and people like that. Also, though, they were combating this on a legal level, too. Reading from Gifts of Deceit, a short paragraph. To assert Master's position authoritatively, the Moon organization hired outstanding legal talent. Moon's own attorney was Charles Stillman of New York. Bohee Pak retained John Bray and Frank Lilly of one of Washington's largest firms, Arendt, Fox, Kintner, Plotkin, and Kahn. The Unification Church was represented by the firm of Melrod, Redman, and Gartland. Former Watergate prosecutor Richard Benveniste, along with Michael Golden, handled most of Melrod, Redman, and Gartland's work for the church. Okay, Richard Benveniste, of course, is a name most of you are familiar with, at least those of you who are old enough to have been around to watch the Watergate proceedings when they were on the air.
Okay, now, the fact that Richard Benveniste, an assistant Watergate prosecutor, was among the attorneys representing elements of the Unification Church who were the defendants in the Watergate Scandal is worth noting here, because a fellow we've talked about a great deal in the past was selected as the special counsel to the to the House Ethics Committee and Senate the Ethics Committees investigating the influence buying on behalf of the Republic of Korea. Now, that fellow who was appointed special counsel for Koreagate was none other than Leon Jaworski. Now, Leon Jaworski, of course, was a person we've looked at in the past. First of all, we've taken a look at him in connection with the Warren Commission's investigation of the assassination of President Kennedy. Now, Leon Jaworski was a special counsel to the Warren Commission. He was also special counsel to the Texas Court of Inquiry, which investigated the Kennedy assassination, or allegedly investigated the Kennedy assassination on behalf of the state of Texas. And specifically, Jaworski's role for the Warren Commission was investigating whether or not Lee Harvey Oswald had any intelligence connections. And the evidence that he did is massive. And
however, it should be mentioned that is not the evidence that Leon Jaworski came out with.
That was exactly it. That Leon Jaworski said nothing here, and that is to say the least, highly suspect, since there are massive indications that Oswald had many connections with profound connections with several U.S. intelligence agencies, including the FBI, the CIA, and Naval Intelligence. Okay, Leon Jaworski found none of those intelligence connections, and possibly the reason for that was that Leon Jaworski himself had a very definite intelligence connection, or at least one definite connection that's come to light so far. Leon Jaworski was head of an organization, and recall that we looked at all of this information in our Guns of November program, and again, those broadcasts, like the Radio Free America broadcasts, are available for somebody if you'd like if you missed those and you'd like to catch up on those. Give us a call after the program. We'll tell you how you can pick them up. But in our Guns of November broadcast about the assassination of President Kennedy, we took a look at the fact that Leon Jaworski, now member of the Warren Commission, Watergate special prosecutor and special counsel for the investigation of Koreagate, Leon Jaworski was head of an organization called the M.D. Anderson Fund. The M.D. Anderson Fund was identified as a CIA domestic funding conduit, so therefore it's highly suspect or highly questionable whether Leon Jaworski should have even been allowed to serve on either the Warren Commission or as Watergate special prosecutor. Now recall when Jaworski was selected to replace Archibald Cox as Watergate prosecutor in the so-called Saturday Night Massacre, in which Archibald Cox and several Justice Department officials left. Basically, Cox was fired. Several Justice Department officials refused to fire Archibald Cox, and they resigned instead. So that's where the name Saturday Night Massacre came from. Leon Jaworski then replaces Cox as Watergate Special Prosecutor, and among the many people that we looked at who figure both in the Kennedy assassination and in Watergate was none other than Richard Nixon himself, who was in Dallas, Texas on November 22nd, 1963. When interviewed by the FBI 2 months later, he lied about it. At least we have to assume it was a lie. He, for some reason, was unable to remember that he was in Dallas, Texas on November 22nd, 1963. In fact, within 2 months, Richard Nixon's memory was off by a full 48 hours. He told the FBI that he left on November 20th, 1963. Now, recall, of course, that Nixon ran against President Kennedy in 1960, was defeated by him, and one of the things they say about the Kennedy assassination is that everyone remembers where they were when they heard that Kennedy was assassinated. Well, Richard Nixon, apparently, within 2 months, his memory was off by a full 48 hours, if we are to presume innocence on his part. And recall the interesting connections of Watergate Special Prosecutor and former Warren Commission counsel Leon Jaworski. He then jumps to be Koreagate Special Prosecutor. Recall the profound connections between the American intelligence establishment and the Moonies, and recall that one of the defense attorneys working on behalf of the Moonies was none other than former Watergate prosecutor Richard Benveniste, who worked with Leon Jaworski. It's quite a mouthful, quite a few things to remember, but it's worth tying all of these things up so that we start getting some of the feeling for the various themes which run through the various broadcasts that we're talking about, and the information which is now beginning to sort of pile up in these Radio Free America broadcasts.
You still have to read this section, too.
Oh, well, my God, that's really going to be quite a task here. Okay, so we're going to have to get this get my mouth dried out, and okay, here we go. Get our equipment all stashed away here. I'd forgotten all about. I'm glad you reminded me. Anyway, remember all of the stuff after that. This little interlude. Remember Leon Jaworski, remember Nixon, remember the unifications connections to both, recall the connections of both Nixon and Jaworski to the assassination of President Kennedy. And we'll also, before we get into another aspect of the Unification Church, it might be worth mentioning also that in another Radio Free America broadcast in which we dealt with Messrs. Wilson and Turple, the quote ex unquote CIA agents, it was mentioned by Frank Turple that Edwin Wilson had connections with Tongson Park, and that they had in fact worked quite closely together. That information is corroborated, by the way, in a current book which has some information about Watergate called Secret Agenda by a man named Jim Hogan, whose book Spooks we're going to touch on in just a second. Now, another organization which figures both in connection with the Moonies and in connection with the assassination of President Kennedy is something called the World Anti-Communist League. And the World Anti-Communist League is currently chaired by a fellow by the name of John Singlaub, an American general, former general of ultra-right-wing persuasion. And two names that we're going to be looking at in connection with the Unification Church are a couple of former Japanese war criminals named Roichi Sasakawa and Yoshio Kodama. Both men mentioned in Gifts of Deceit as follows. In 1969, Moon decided it was time to get his rank and file in America busy combating communism. He had been waging extensive anti-communist campaigns in Korea and Japan under the aegis of his International Federation for the Extermination of Communism, with political and financial support from Roichi Sasakawa, R-O-Y-O-I-C-H-I-S-A-S-A-K-A-W-A, and Yoshio Kodama, Y-O-S-H-I-O-K-O-D-A-M-A. Beginning that sentence again. He had been waging extensive anti-communist campaigns in Korea and Japan under the aegis of his International Federation for the Extermination of Communism, with political and financial support from Roichi Sasakawa and Yoshio Kodama and other powerful Japanese right-wing figures. He organized the Freedom Leadership Foundation, the FLF, the American branch of his International Federation. Its president, Alan Tate Wood, mobilized Moonie groups throughout the country to lobby for the hawk position in Vietnam and to try and defuse the peace movement. Wood and 8 other American Moonie leaders attended the annual conference of the World Anti-Communist League in Kyoto, Japan in September of 1970. The conference was the biggest ever held by the World League, largely because the sponsoring organization that year was a Moon group, Shokyo Rengo, S-H-O-K-Y-O-R-E-N-G-O, the Japanese branch of his International Anti-Communist Federation. Master ordered the Japanese Moonies to prepare for the event with a massive fundraising drive, which reportedly yielded $1.4 million brought in by selling flowers in the streets. Through the KCFF, the Moon organization was able to engage Senator Strom Thurmond as guest speaker. Of course, Strom Thurmond very much on the scene today, and another, well, I couldn't call him a figure on the new right, but one of the linchpins of the old right who has lingered to this day. Now, before we proceed here with these two Japanese war criminals, again, very much affiliated with the Moonies, let's review the connection of the World Anti-Communist League to the assassination of President Kennedy.
One of the most interesting events in the story of the assassination of John F. Kennedy was, of course, Lee Harvey Oswald's visit to Russia. This has been talked about a great deal, and yet quite a few of the details of the visit itself and Lee Harvey Oswald's return are not talked about quite so much. One of the things that is not mentioned is, again, the entire Warren Commission thesis is based on the fact that well, not based, but it's largely hung on the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald is some kind of a disaffected leftist. Well, there are numerous accounts of Lee Harvey Oswald's right-wing connections of various sorts and types. One of the interesting examples is that the only person, Lee Harvey Oswald was at the Atsugi Naval Air Base in Japan, defected to Russia, supposedly taking with him secrets that he threatened to give to the Russians about America's most important defense systems. Yet after Lee Harvey Oswald had spent quite some time in Russia and came back, the only people who met him, there was no official deprogramming of Lee.
Remember all of the stuff after that, this little interlude. Remember Leon Jaworski, remember Nixon, remember the unifications connections to both, recall the connections of both Nixon and Jaworski to the assassination of President Kennedy. And we'll also, before we get into another aspect of the Unification Church, it might be worth mentioning also that in another Radio Free America broadcast in which we dealt with Messrs. Wilson and Turple, the quote ex-unquote CIA agents, it was mentioned by Frank Turple that Edwin Wilson had connections with Tongson Park and that they had in fact worked quite closely together. That information is corroborated, by the way, in a current book which has some information about Watergate called Secret Agenda by a man named Jim Hogan, whose book Spooks we're going to touch on in just a second. Now, another organization which figures both in connection with the Moonies and in connection with the assassination of President Kennedy is something called the World Anti-Communist League. And the World Anti-Communist League is currently chaired by a fellow by the name of John Singlaub, an American general, former general of ultra-right-wing persuasion. And two names that we're going to be looking at in connection with the Unification Church are a couple of former Japanese war criminals named Roichi Sasakawa and Yoshio Kodama. Both men mentioned in Gifts of Deceit as follows. In 1969, Moon decided it was time to get his rank and file in America busy combating communism. He had been waging extensive anti-communist campaigns in Korea and Japan under the aegis of his International Federation for the Extermination of Communism, with political and financial support from Roichi Sasakawa, R-O-I-C-H-I-S-A-S-A-K-A-W-A, and Yoshio Kodama, Y-O-S-H-I-O-K-O-D-A-M-A. Beginning that sentence again. He had been waging extensive anti-communist campaigns in Korea and Japan under the aegis of his International Federation for the Extermination of Communism, with political and financial support from Roichi Sasakawa and Yoshio Kodama and other powerful Japanese right-wing figures. He organized the Freedom Leadership Foundation, the FLF, the American branch of his International Federation. Its president, Alan Tate Wood, mobilized Moonie groups throughout the country to lobby for the hawk position in Vietnam and to try and defuse the peace movement. Wood and 8 other American Moonie leaders attended the annual conference of the World Anti-Communist League in Kyoto, Japan in September of 1970. The conference was the biggest ever held by the World League, largely because the sponsoring organization that year was a Moon group, Shokyo Rengo, S-H-O-K-Y-O-R-E-N-G-O, the Japanese branch of his International Anti-Communist Federation. Master ordered the Japanese Moonies to prepare for the event with a massive fundraising drive, which reportedly yielded $1.4 million brought in by selling flowers in the streets. Through the KCFF, the Moon organization was able to engage Senator Strom Thurmond as guest speaker. Of course, Strom Thurmond very much on the scene today, and another, well, I couldn't call him a figure on the new right, but one of the linchpins of the old right who has lingered to this day. Now, before we proceed here with these two Japanese war criminals, again, very much affiliated with the Moonies, let's review the connection of the World Anti-Communist League to the assassination of President Kennedy.
One of the most interesting events in the story of the assassination of John F. Kennedy was, of course, Lee Harvey Oswald's visit to Russia. This has been talked about a great deal, and yet quite a few of the details of the visit itself and Lee Harvey Oswald's return are not talked about quite so much. One of the things that is not mentioned is, again, the entire Warren Commission thesis is based on the fact that well, not based, but it's largely hung on the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald is some kind of a disaffected leftist. Well, there are numerous accounts of Lee Harvey Oswald's right-wing connections of various sorts and types. One of the interesting examples is that the only person, Lee Harvey Oswald was at the Atsugi Naval Air Base in Japan, defected to Russia, supposedly taking with him secrets that he threatened to give to the Russians about America's most important defense systems. Yet after Lee Harvey Oswald had spent quite some time in Russia and came back, the only people who met him, there was no official deprogramming of Lee Harvey Oswald, no official people coming to meet him and see what he had been up to, this supposed enemy of the country, this leftist who defected with naval air secrets to Russia. The only person who met him was a representative of Traveler's Aid by the name of Spaz T. Rakin, kind of an unusual name, S-P-A-A-S-T, and then Rakin, last name R-A-I-K-I-N. Spaz Rakin was, yes, representing Traveler's Aid. He also happened to be representing the World Anti-Communist League, of which he was a prominent member. So the person who actually came to meet Lee Harvey Oswald was, indeed, a leading member of the World Anti-Communist League.
He was also, by the way, that Friends of the League of Anti-Bolshevik Nations was one of the organizations that Spaz T. Rakin was affiliated with, and that was affiliated, among other things, with the Galen organization. So, again, a Galen connection to the World Anti-Communist League, to Lee Harvey Oswald, and to this whole tangle of events running through the assassination of President Kennedy, Watergate, Koreagate, and on up to the El Camino, where they all sell flowers as we drive along.
That's right. So poor Lee Harvey Oswald, lost leftist, comes back from the Soviet Union, and who is there to give him coffee and donuts but a representative of the World Anti-Communist League, who, as we all know, spend a great deal of their time out helping lost and disaffected leftists on the streets and bringing them things to eat and welcoming them back to the United States.
Particularly when these leftists have betrayed the United States officially.
Military secrets, indeed. Okay, we've got a great deal more to go just on Yoshio Kodama and a bit on Ruichi Sasakawa. However, you folks have been sitting there, those of you who are listening have been sitting there listening for about an hour and 45 minutes, and we have been similarly sitting for about an hour and 45 minutes. So we are going to take a short break, about 6-7 minutes duration. Confused, we're just casual here. Good evening, this is Nip Tuck back with you in the studios with Dave Emory. And just to remind you that we are here, we've been sort of thrust untimely into a slightly different studio, and we're not quite sure necessarily of everything that's going on. It's not a new studio, actually; it's the old studio, but we haven't used it for several months, so we're kind of fiddling around here with things and moving things. So there will be some occasional little flaws in the air sound. We know that those of you out there who are loyal enough to listen to this kind of stuff will just look right past it. Anyway, what did I want to mention else? I think that's about it, basically. We're going to go back to the subject at hand, and as you remember when we stopped before the break, and by the way, I should mention for those of you who are just tuning in and don't know what's going on, that what you're listening to is a Radio Free America archive broadcast. This is the third part of our series on mind control. We're dealing specifically with cults tonight. We've already talked about Jonestown, and we're in the middle of talking about the Moonies and their various political connections. One of the things, of course, we're doing is tracing the political connections of some of these specific cults, and in these cases, all of the ones we're talking about have some kind of connection directly into not only national security establishment, but also back to the Axis, that being, of course, the German and Japanese Axis, and Italian, etc., during World War II. So, anyway, without further ado, let me just tell you again, you are listening to Radio Free America. This is Nip Tuck here with Dave Emory, and this is KF.
Now, recall that all of the political machinations that we've been covering really should be set against the tapestry of mind control, because all of these organizations that we're touching on, Jonestown, the Unification Church, the Ananda Marga group that we're going to be discussing in just a few minutes, essentially have been charged by or definitely established as performing mind control of one sort or another on their adherents, okay? Now recall that with the Unification Church, its roots go back to Imperial Japan, Fascist Japan, the country that we fought in the Pacific Theater during World War II. Korea was a Japanese colony. All of the key figures in the Korean national security establishment after World War II had originally trained as part of the Fascist Japanese national security establishment. We were taking a look at a couple of fellows named Roichi Sasakawa and Yoshio Kodama, and we're going to go into both of those, the careers of both of those individuals, particularly Yoshio Kodama at some length in just a minute. Before evaluating Yoshio Kodama's efforts, I think it's important to discuss a little bit of the history of how fascism came to Japan. And the main thing we're going to focus on now are the working of the so-called patriotic societies. Now, we'll cover this information in some detail on a future Radio Free America broadcast, probably one dealing with the origins of fascism, how fascism came to be established in the Axis nations. But we'd like to give you a thumbnail synopsis of it right now. Basically, the fascist government of Japan, the one against which we fought in World War II, came to power exactly as the fascist government of Germany did, through a program of assassinations. The legitimate political leadership of Japan was systematically wiped out through a series of very clumsy and quite overt political assassinations. These assassinations were carried out by a number of different groups, primarily what are known as the patriotic societies. Now, the patriotic societies were a major organ of Japanese nationalism and militarism during the early part of the 20th century, actually the late part of the 19th century as well. They also functioned as espionage organizations both inside Japan and abroad. Now, the patriotic societies were composed of a loose association of criminals, underworld entrepreneurs, thugs, strong-armed men. They were very heavily infiltrated by the military as well, though. Military cadets played a very important role in the patriotic societies and in the assassination program, which paved the way for fascism to arrive in Japan. Now, the patriotic societies, as I said, their relationship with the military is incestuous. The military infiltrates the patriotic societies, and it also manipulates those very same societies. The assassination program, primarily carried out by the patriotic societies, eliminates the legitimate political leadership of Japan and paves the way for fascism to come to that country. A good book which sums up it describes in detail the workings of the patriotic societies, in particular their role in assassinating the legitimate Japanese political leadership. An excellent book was authored by a man named Hugh Bias, last name B-Y-A-S. His book, published in 1942, was called Government by Assassination. Before reading a little bit of that book, I'd like to give you a little bit on Hugh Bias's background. It says on the back of Government by Assassination, Hugh Bias was born in Scotland, had his early training on Scottish country newspapers, and joined the staff of the London Times in 1909. 5 years later, he went to Tokyo to edit the Japan Advertiser, an independent American daily. He remained there all through World War I, when Japan was our ally, and until 1922. At that time he went back to London, but 4 years later he returned to Tokyo as correspondent for the London Times, and the following year became representative of the New York Times as well. When he left Tokyo in April of 1941 on the second-to-last mail steamer, he was the dean of the foreign correspondents in that city and had seen their number grow from the original 3 to more than 60, half of whom were Germans. So that's who the fellow is whose expertise we're going to rely on here. His book, once again, called Government by Assassination. Copyrighted in 1942 by Alfred A. Knopf and Company. And I'd like to read you a short section of the jacket which will sum up the working of the Japanese patriotic societies with regard to the assassination program which brought fascism to Japan. Bias writes as follows. Well, actually, this is from the overleaf and to Hugh Bias's book, Government by Assassination. It sort of sums up the thesis of the whole book, and we will delve into this book at some length in the future. Only a man who lived in Japan for 23 years and could produce this sensational revelation of the secret power of the Japanese militarists. Anyway, Here is the truth about the patriotic murder societies, the army gangsters, the army's idea of Japan's destiny, and the strange role of the emperor. In Japan, the army possesses a kind of autonomy which immunizes it from control by any other agency. Long ago, Mr. Bias saw that the intoxication of this immunity would lead to war, and so he spent many years ferreting out from the secretive Japanese how the militarists gained their fantastic power. His book, therefore, is to Japan what Rauschning's Revolution of Nihilism was to Germany. Starting from the grassroots of Japanese politics, it moves steadily toward the amazing disclosure of principles. At bottom, the Japanese army is closely allied with gangsterism. The so-called patriotic societies which do its dirty work are nothing more than leagues of murderers, blackmailers, and thieves. Bias shows how these terrorists made contact years ago with certain groups of appreciative younger officers, and how consequently almost every civilian leader who curbed the army's power was assassinated. So basically, the Japanese patriotic societies, through this assassination program at the behest of the military and using gangsters, bring fascism to Japan. They also serve as a very, very important organ of foreign intelligence. Okay, the secret societies are one of the main, not only the assassination wing, which brings militarism to power, they are also a prime ideological generating force. They helped generate the swing to militarism that overtook Japan. They also serve as a very powerful overseas espionage organization, and that's one of the places we're going to pick them up right now. Now, basically, Nip Tuck's going to read you a little bit from a book about the Japanese intelligence service, and you cannot divorce, I should say, the workings of the patriotic societies in any way from the workings of Japanese espionage.
Okay, this teeny section, which I'm going to read from, although we will read a little bit more from this book later on, is from a book called Kempitai, spelled K-E-M-P-E-I-T-A-I. That was the Japanese Secret Service, and the book is subheaded A History of the Japanese Secret Service. The book was written by Richard Deacon, published in paperback by Berkeley Books of New York, first published in paperback in 1983. Okay, just a short section here, and just a name in particular that we're going to want you to hold on to for later reference, and then we're going to go on to Yoshio Kodama and his involvement with these particular groups. But this first segment, we just want you to note one thing, reading from the book. Secret societies actively engaged in intelligence gathering for their country proliferated throughout the 20s and 30s and made an invaluable contribution to Japan's need for a worldwide network. As these societies took varying forms, it was easy for one or other of them to search out such likely recruits as Trebitsch Lincoln, who's a man they've just talked about a little earlier, the two Boses, B-O-S-E, Bose, the two Boses and other malcontents who could be won over to a cleverly painted portrait of a prosperous Asia under Japanese protection and guidance. Okay, Bose is the key name here, a man named Subhash Chandra Bose that we're going to be talking about a little later in the broadcast, and we will get to in a moment.
So now, we're going to go back to Yoshio Kodama, who was a key figure in the Japanese patriotic societies, also very much involved with the Moonies and the World Anti-Communist League. So as you hear about Kodama, recall his affiliation with the Japanese patriotic societies and their three-pronged role. First of all, as the prime generator of Japanese ultranationalism and militarism, as the actual organ of assassination which brought that militarism and nationalism to power, it actually empowered that philosophy, and as a powerful organ of overseas intelligence for Imperial Japan.
Yeah, and to make, again, a rather broad political point that needs to be made every now and then, bear in mind that this is a man who was an ultranationalist, right-wing Japanese, a very wealthy industrialist who got involved with a variety of things, and to this day, as far as I know, although he may have finally died, but
he died this year.
This year, that's right. Okay, that's what I thought. But right up until his death was involved in such things as shipping millions of dollars to the United States to be used by the Moonies for things like the Washington Times. Will be used specifically for the Washington Times. Now, this is a man who basically was a right-wing fanatic who supported the Japanese fascist regime, the same Japanese fascist regime that was slaughtering people all over Asia and later slaughtering United States troops all over the Pacific. And again, we see after the United States and the Allied powers come in after World War II that these people are basically put back on the street to the point where they can go on to influence United States public opinion 40 years after the war. Okay, we're going to be reading from Spooks by James Hogan, a book that we have recommended a great deal on this show. An excellent book, a very complex book that covers a whole lot of different subjects, but one that if you can have the patience to sit and get about 50 pages into it, you will find yourself so caught up that you will not want to put it down. Hogan, by the way, is spelled Hougan, and the edition we have published William Morrow and Company, 1978. Hogan also just came out with a book just a couple of weeks ago called The Hidden Agenda?
Secret Agenda.
Secret Agenda.
Which mentions the Tongson Park Ed Wilson connection that we spoke about a little while ago.
Okay. Hogan writes as follows. An ultranationalist and terrorist leader at 15, Kodama, self-same Yoshio Kodama, immersed himself in the political bedlam of Depression Japan, joining an even score of conspiratorial societies, with such names as the Blood Brotherhood, Holy War Execution League, Federation of Radical Patriotic Workers, and the Capital Rise Asia Academy. These societies, many of them murderous and fly-by-night affairs, provided him with a precarious living. Ostensibly political, they were often no more than street gangs manipulated for private ends by wealthy industrialists, the police, and the army. They fought the communists and one another with equal frequency, and underwent a continual factionalization. Often the societies consisted of no more than a dozen friends, a post office box, and stolen gelignite. It was in this right-wing milieu, part underworld and part underground, that Kodama plotted to conduct a battle of the Emperor's entourage, a state massacre that would eliminate at one stroke all the most powerful men in the realm. A premature explosion led the plot awry, however, and Kodama found himself beginning the first in a series of prison terms meted out to him for his terrorist activities. Molding himself into the image of a 20th century samurai, devoting himself to the martial arts and traditional Buddhist meditation practices, the young Kodama refined his political beliefs as well. By 1940, he'd forged a peculiar ideology, combining elements of fascism with those of Japanese feudalism. He'd also forged powerful links to Japan's military intelligence apparatus, carrying out numerous secret missions to Manchuria. As a reward for his intelligence work, he was entrusted with the task of supplying the Japanese Navy in wartime. Establishing the Kodama Kikan, or Kodama Agency, he built a financial empire from a handful of rooms in Shanghai's Shin Asia Hotel. According to formerly secret reports of the U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps, Kodama accomplished the Navy's ends at gunpoint, taking hostages and forcing Chinese villagers to sell him the goods he demanded. Paying a pittance to the Chinese, he then resold the goods at fabulous profit to the Imperial Navy. Systematically looting China of its raw materials, he amassed a personal fortune of colossal dimensions. To accomplish that, he acquired heroin on the black market in Tokyo, traded it for tungsten in Shanghai, sold the tungsten for yen, used the yen to buy guns, sold the guns in Borneo for gold, exchanged the gold for industrial diamonds, and in the meantime cornered the Shanghai radium market by emptying the hospitals of their supplies. In addition, he operated salt mines, iron mines, farms, fisheries, an orphanage, a molybdenum mine, and secret munitions factories throughout central China. In his heroin deals, he sometimes burned the consumer, and there were unproven allegations that the yen spent in China was counterfeit. Not that it mattered, since it was useless to the Chinese in any case. He came to be regarded as, quote, the man behind the Kempitai, or secret police, financing its Shanghai office in return for its, quote, physical support. Intelligence reports show that this was sometimes bloody work, revealing that Kodama was suspected of assassinating his partner and of taking part in a massacre of Chinese at the Shin Asia Hotel.
And before continuing with Hogan's narrative here, recall the things that we're looking at here. An underworld entrepreneur trading in, among other things, heroin, and using the proceeds from this underworld business empire to finance the Japanese Secret Service, the Kempeitai, the Japanese intelligence service. This is a pattern that we're going to see. This combination of underworld business entrepreneurship and intelligence is a long-standing pattern, and one that we've looked at in the past and are going to look at again in the future. Continuing with Hogan's narrative from Spooks, at war's end, the 34-year-old was a brigadier general, a cabinet advisor, and the possessor of a financial hoard that included a room full of platinum, sacks of industrial diamonds, an undetermined amount of foreign currency, and upward of 3.5 billion yen, not including liquid assets. Just how much Kodama was worth, however, could not be exactly ascertained. All documents of the Kodama Kikan were burned at the end of the war, and Kodama himself admits that he hid most of his wealth. Imprisoned as a war crime suspect in 1946, note that, he'd been attempting to organize a new political party for Japan, a party in naked emulation of those that govern the United States. This democratic pretense, however, failed to deceive American occupation authorities. An intelligence assessment of Kodama concludes, quote, "In summary, Kodama appears to be a man doubly dangerous. His long and fanatic involvement in ultra-nationalistic activities, violence included, and his skill in appealing to youth make him a man who, if released from internment, would surely be a grave security risk. In addition, there is the outstanding probability to be reckoned with that, as a result of his hearty cooperation with the war effort, he has a large fortune to back up whatever activities he might see fit to undertake. His success in the difficulties of securing supplies in wartime for the Navy mark him as one who could very easily become a big-time operator in Japan's Reconstruction period. Persistent rumors as to his black market profits in his Shanghai period, plus his known opportunism, are forceful arguments that he would be as unscrupulous in trade as he was in ultranationalism. Kodama's past performance indicates that he is the sort of man G2 considers more dangerous than either the superannuated ideologists or the professional men who aided Japan's wartime effort for reasons of patriotism or survival of their professional interests. Dangerous potentialities for the future. Another report, prepared by Kodama's chief inquisitor, Lieutenant Frank O'Neill, concludes, quote, "I am satisfied that Kodama or his associates, for whom he is responsible, committed numerous acts of violence in China by the acquisition by foul means or fair of commodities and goods belonging to the Chinese." Shortly after this assessment was made, and in spite of it, Kodama was released without trial. Walking out of prison with him was Nobusuke Kishi, a future prime minister, and 17 other war crime suspects who would become the financial and political spine of a new democratic Japan. By the way, Nobusuke Kishi's last name is Kishi. Why was Kodama released? The last pages of his diary give a clue. Quote, "Who, in this age of ideological confusion, is capable of bringing the laboring masses, influenced completely by communist ideals and rampaging like a wounded beast, under control. The bestial roar of the Communist Party reaches into my cell through the barred windows of Sugamo prison. I can hear the dull thud of the marching feet of thousands of communists advancing towards the Bolshevization of Japan. Who will fight the last fight with them? Behind the steel bars of Sugamo, this young life of mine, burning with the passionate ardor of a love of my country and of justice, strains against the bars that hold it in," unquote. A few days after Kodama's release, Lieutenant Frank O'Neill was reported to have predicted, quote, "10 years from today, this man Kodama is going to be a great leader of Japan," unquote. He was right. Working behind the scenes, Kodama established the Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP, using funds hoarded from his Shanghai days. It soon became the most important political party in Asia, leading some to suspect that Kodama's release from Sugamo had been engineered by the fledgling CIA. Whether that is so or not, Kodama rapidly consolidated his hold over Japan's ultranationalists and re-established contact with anti-communist gangsters and street punks from the Tokyo Ginza. Before long, his flunkies would brag in print of his role behind the scenes, describing him as, quote, "the driving force," unquote, in Japanese politics. Before we continue with the narrative here, I think it might be worthwhile to just ruminate over what we just read for a second or two. Now here, Yoshio Kodama is able to make the transition from being basically a defeated imperialist, a Japanese war criminal. Remember, he was imprisoned on suspicion of having committed war crimes in China, and basically he is the man behind the Kempei tie and the fellow who is able to basically become the chief procurement officer, I guess you could call it, for the Japanese Navy. Now, his underworld activities, intimately and inextricably bound up with his activities as a Japanese intelligence agent, basically provide him with enough funds to begin his post-war career. So there is something of a question about the continuity between Yoshio Kodama's underground activities on behalf of Japanese intelligence during World War II and his post-war revival as one of the main forces in the, quote, new unquote, Japanese politics, and that perhaps his elevation and release from prison took place with the aid of the CIA. And as Nip Tuck noted earlier in the broadcast, again, we see the United States turning to fascists, previous enemies and newly defeated enemies, in order to basically further its anti-communist goals in this portion of the world. But in particular, keep in mind the possibility here that Hogan suggests that profits and assets acquired during his wartime role as a Japanese intelligence agent and underground entrepreneur financed, at least to some extent, his post-war rise as a major political force in the new Japan.
Also, since we're going to see, as we've heard to an extent already, and will be covered more a little bit, Kodama becomes a power within the Unification Church, specifically in Japan. It's interesting again to note his beginnings in the trade of guns and drugs. As we've talked about another One Step Beyond, there have been numerous allegations now that the Unification Church has many contacts in the East, in Asia right now, in much the same way that the United States security establishment has, that are themselves involved in peddling drugs, and that several of the United States client governments or sub-governments in Asia of the right-wing persuasion are involved in drug peddling. And the Moonies, the Unification Church, has been doing, among other things, a propaganda campaign for many years for some of these groups to explain why that whatever they do, it's okay, we shouldn't worry about them peddling drugs because they're, after all, fighting communism. So the activities that originally made Yoshio Kodama rich are still being justified by the Unification Church and, of course, behind the scenes by our own intelligence establishment.
Now recall, of course, the many powerful individuals and the many important American political organizations touched or influenced by the Moonies, because, again, we're going back to the Japanese war criminals. We're going back to the people who bombed Pearl Harbor, and if that sounds like a bit of hyperbole, in the passage Nip Tuck's about to read you, we're going to see some actual connections between these people and the people who literally planned the attack on Pearl Harbor.
Continuing on with Hogan's narrative, indeed, by 1958, Kodama was again one of the most powerful men in the Orient, almost as influential in Korea as he was in Japan. In that year, he signed the first of many contracts with the Lockheed Corporation, promising to reverse Japan's decision to outfit its born-again Air Force with Grumman F-11Fs. To accomplish that reversal, he relied upon a bizarre cast that included an American-born espionage agent who'd lost his citizenship by working for the Japanese in occupied Manchuria, another spook who'd plied his trade in southern China, a politician who was later jailed for embezzlement, an extreme right-wing publisher, various war crimes suspects who'd shared the anxieties of Sugamo, and the architect of Pearl Harbor, General Minoru Genda. Appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Air Force, through the backing of Kodama and Kishi, then Prime Minister-in-Chief of the National Defense Council, and you remember that Kishi was being held at Sugamo with Yoshio Kodama, and walked at the same time. Minoru Genda was wildly enthusiastic about the Lockheed Starfighter. After testing it in California, he returned to Japan with a recommendation that only the Starfighter would do. At about the same time, Genda's recommendation was echoed by a special delegation of German Air Force officers, including General Gunther Rahl, who'd arrived in Tokyo to persuade recalcitrant Japanese of the Starfighter's dubious superiority. Supported then by Japan's most honored military figure, by its respected ally in the preceding war, by the Prime Minister, and by Kodama's political manipulations, Lockheed accomplished the impossible. Grumman's contract evaporated. A few months later, after the Lockheed contract was signed, General Genda was awarded the U.S. Legion of Merit by the American Air Force, 17 years after he'd annihilated its planes in Hawaii. I want to just go back over that one more time so you can see the wonders of history. A few months later, after the Lockheed contract was signed, General Minoru Genda was awarded the U.S. Legion of Merit by the American Air Force, 17 years after this man had put together the annihilation of the American Naval Air Force at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. How fast times change. Indeed, 1958 was a busy year for Kodama. Besides the difficulty of engineering the Lockheed sale, he was called upon to preserve the disintegrating political position of Prime Minister Kishi. Regarded by many as an American puppet for having pushed an unpopular Japanese-American security treaty through the Diet. The Diet, of course, is the Japanese parliament. Kishi appeared to be on the way out. Kodama, however, was able to save him. rallying the right wing to his standard and provoking street demonstrations in his behalf. Those demonstrations were countered by even larger ones organized by the left, and it appeared that President Eisenhower's impending visit to Japan would result in widespread bloodshed. With the demos gathering force, U.S. and Japanese authorities called upon Kodama to take charge of Operation Protect Ike. Moving with customary quiet, the former assassin pried loose an estimated $2,300,000 in, quote, contributions from local businessmen, ultranationalists, and racketeers. With that in hand, he hired platoons of anti-communist street fighters, providing them with riot gear, trucks, and helicopters. At the last minute, however, Ike's visit was aborted, as American authorities contemplated what appeared to be the makings of a massacre. Sometime after the mooting of Operation Protect Ike, Kodama seems to have joined the Unification Church, gravitating toward that organization through the auspices of Ryuichi Sasakawa. He spells it here Sasagawa with a G, and we've seen it both ways. An old friend of Kodama's, a veteran of Sugamo, in other words, the prison where the suspected war criminals are being held, and the Shanghai-Manchuria intrigue, Sasakawa came into enormous wealth after the war, becoming, among many other things, chairman of the Japan Shipbuilding Association. An ultranationalist whose views paralleled Kodama's, Sasakawa established himself in his friend's mold, becoming one of Japan's leading kurumaku, which means black curtain, which comes from the kabuki drama and refers to the curtain that hangs at the back of the stage and hides people who hand out a lot of the props and things like that, and do the voices too. In other words, somebody behind the scenes. Just as Kodama privately financed military exercises on the remote island of Choju, Sasakawa lavished money on Tokyo's martial arts societies, a euphemism that might cover everything from karate clubs to paramilitary cabals. Sasakawa's pet project, however, was Win Over Communism, WOC, a fundraising subsidiary of the Unification Church. Sasakawa served as WOC's chairman and Kodama as its chief advisor. This needn't indicate any special religiosity on the part of either man. On the contrary, the Unification Church's evangelical anti-communism is a bulwark of South Korean stability, and as such, protective of Kodama's investments in that country. Still, the implications of Kodama's relationship to WOC and the allegedly Reverend Sun Myung Moon are interesting to ponder. The recipient of untold Lockheed millions, Kodama was the aircraft firm's agent in both Japan and Korea. Other corporations, notably Gulf, have been shaken down for, quote, political contributions by Korea's Park regime, the quids quo being the right to do business there. It's almost incredible that Kodama, with his influence and investments in South Korea, should not have provided Park's minions with support, financial and otherwise. If he did, then his affiliation with WOC is particularly suggestive. Specifically, it raises the specter of the Lockheed Corporation subsidizing the Moonies' spread from Seoul to Savannah by means of bribes laundered through Hong Kong by an apostate Spanish missionary, see below, is somebody they're going to talk about later, for delivery in so-called beacons boxes to the industry's kurumaku in Tokyo. Okay, let me just read that last again because this is going to be made clear in the part that Dave is going to, I believe in the part you're going to read.
Well,
are we skipping over that?
Yeah, well, yeah, we're going to skip over this part, and so this I think will sort of wind things up for Kodama. I think we should recap because we're not going to leave the Japanese patriotic societies. However, we are going to move on from the Moonies to another organization with roots going back to the Japanese patriotic societies. Again, among all the organizations, to take a look, I should say, at all of the powerful organizations and people that are connected to the Unification Church. Here, Hogan suggests rather directly that the Lockheed Corporation had a great deal to do with the spreading of Yoshio Kodama and Sasakawa's Mooney influences. Okay, so the Lockheed Corporation, of course, is a major U.S. defense contractor. It is the largest employer here in the Santa Clara Valley, and very possibly connected to the Unification Church through Kodama and Sasakawa. In fact, definitely connected to the Unification Church through Kodama and Sasakawa. And again, recall that these people, Kodama and Sasakawa, of the World Anti-Communist League and the Unification Church, are essentially Japanese war criminals. They fought against the United States, and recall Kodama's connections to Mr. Genda, the fellow who planned the attack on Pearl Harbor. And again, think about the fact that these are people who did not think twice about attacking the United States and taking American lives, and here they are involved with this organization, the Unification Church, which is nothing if not totalitarian in its character. And think about the connections between the Japanese fascists and the Unification Church, and the Unification Church's connections to so many different aspects of American society. And in particular, I can't emphasize the point strongly enough. As you drive down the El Camino on a sunny day, you see all these people smiling and waving and selling flowers and so forth. Virtually all of those people are Moonies. And one of the things, by the way, that Moon teaches his followers is to lie if anybody asks if you're connected with the Unification Church. So as you see these smiling little people waving the flowers, you just think about the Arizona going up at Pearl Harbor, because there is a direct connection between the two, okay? And in particular, a thought that I'll toss out to you here, and you can consider this as we go through the broadcast, and perhaps if we have time for phone calls at the end, you can respond to this, but consider the Unification Church as basically an analog of the Japanese patriotic societies. Recall that they not only served as an espionage arm, they committed assassinations, and they also were a prime generative force of the nationalism and militarism which propelled Japan into World War II. Interestingly enough, the man Robert Beecher, who wrote the book Gifts of Deceit, the House staffer who wrote the book Gifts of Deceit that we relied on heavily for our information on the Unification Church, died in a very mysterious fall in this past May. He apparently, at the ripe old age of 44, suffered a fatal injury in a fall from the roof of his New York apartment house where he was working as a director or working in connection with the Harlem Dance Theater. So Mr. Beecher is no longer on the scene, having departed at the untimely age of 44. So again, consider the possibility, and we're only tossing this out in a speculative way, but consider the possibility of comparing the Unification Church and also the Ananda Marga group that we're going to talk about with the Japanese patriotic societies. One perhaps could think of them as a successor to those societies operating in the United States and in conjunction with it. I'd like to go back for just a second to the book that Nip Tuck read you a short section of a while ago. The book is called Kempei Tai, Kempei, Tai is the second word, subtitled A History of the Japanese Secret Service, authored by Richard Deacon. Now, in here, Richard Deacon goes back to the is going to talk about, I should say, the most important of the Japanese patriotic societies that paved the way for fascism in Japan in World War II. The most important of all of those societies was called the Black Dragon Society. That organization derived its name from the Amur River, which provides the borderline between Russia, or now the Soviet Union, and China. Amur, I believe, means Black Dragon in Chinese. Now, the Black Dragon Society had served as a vehicle for Japanese espionage against Russia even before it became the Soviet Union, and then after the Bolshevik Revolution, it continued to function in the same fashion and was the major organ of Japanese espionage against the Soviet Union. It also was the single most important of the Japanese patriotic societies, and its influence in the rise of fascism to Japan could not be overemphasized. The two names that we want to know here are a guy named Roi Yoshida. He was the head of the Black Dragon Society when it was working towards World War II, and also a fellow named Mitsuru Toyama, last name Toyama. Mitsuru Toyama, or Mitsuri Toyama as he's referred to here, founded the Black Dragon Society and remained its sort of patron throughout, even when Yoshida took over the active functioning of it. And it's worth noting that the Black Dragon Society was directly connected to the German Nazi Party through a fellow named Don Gatto, who was a Nazi press correspondent in Tokyo. Anyway, in Kempei Tai, Richard Deacon writes of the Black Dragon Society as follows. The Black Dragon Society increased numerically in all-around strength and in political influence in the 1920s and 30s. Dominated by Roi Yoshida, the society laid down its policy as follows, quote, "We shall renovate the present system, foster a foreign policy aiming at expansion overseas, revolutionize domestic policies to increase the happiness of the people, and establish a social policy that will settle problems between labor and capital." And a little farther down, he writes, "The Black Dragon Society was in many respects empirical, that's E-M-P-I-R-I-C-A-L, in outlook as well as chauvinistic. It was just as interested in left-wing revolutionaries as in right-wing reactionaries or muddle-headed liberals, if any of these could be exploited to aid the cause of Japanese expansion. An Indian terrorist who had long campaigned against the British, Rash Bahari Bose, last name B-O-S-E, fled to Japan in 1915 and was befriended by Mitsuru Toyama. Recall, Toyama was the founder and patron of the Black Dragon Society, the single most important individual affiliated with it. Continuing. The latter not only helped Bose to become a Japanese citizen, but adopted him into his family when Bose married one of Toyama's followers. The ex-Indian terrorist became an agent for the Japanese and helped to found the Pan-Asiatic League. This movement was closely linked with the Black Dragon and the Great East Asian Co-Prosperity Project. In all these, Bose played a considerable role. However, Bose was obviously too old for all the work involved in these organizations, and though he worked for the Japanese from Bangkok during World War II, he was eventually succeeded by his namesake, Subhas Chandra Bose, another anti-British Indian the Japanese lured away from Berlin. A similar anti-colonial pro-Japanese body created by the Japanese was the Aryan Army, headed by Raja Mahendra Pratap, P-R-A-T-A-P. This was ultimately taken over by the Indian Independence League of East Asia, which was another of Rash Bahari Bose's brainchildren, and the latter died early in 1945. So these two Bose Indian nationalists, or ultra-nationalists, fascists actually, as we're going to see in just a couple of minutes, are affiliated with the Black Dragon Society. First we have Rash Bahari Bose, who flees to Japan after working against the British, is practically adopted by Mitsuru Toyama, who provides him with a wife. He then goes to work with the Black Dragon Society and Japanese intelligence, preparing for World War II, works for Japan in Bangkok during World War II, and his activities on the Indian subcontinent are basically adopted or co-opted by his successor named Subhas Chandra Bose. That name, S-U-B-H-A-S C-H-A-N-D-R-A, last name B-O-S-E. So recall the two Boses, Rash Bahari and Subhas Chandra Bose, both Indian ultra-nationalists who sought help from fascist Japan in their struggle against the British. And recall, again, their links to the Black Dragon Society, the most important of the patriotic societies, and we've already looked at their connections to the Moonies.
And as we'll see later, the Bose connections extend not only to Japan, but to other places too, and we'll follow up on that. Okay, this is an article that was, originally we read this on One Step Beyond. However, we're going to reread it because it fits right into what we're talking about. This is from the Sunday, August 15th, 1982 edition of the San Jose Mercury News. The headline is Ananda Marga, a deadly mix of yoga, violence, question mark. Subheading is, a cult active on the peninsula says its goals are humanitarian, but others link it to killings around the world. It's by Bernard Bauer, a staff writer for the Mercury. A worldwide sect that runs yoga and meditation classes at a secluded Los Altos Hills house is under investigation by the FBI because it is suspected of engaging in terrorist activities. Publicly, the sect, the Ananda Marga Yoga Society, blends Eastern spiritualism with a wide array of social programs. It operates medical clinics, nursery schools, and food programs for the poor in more than 120 countries, including 2 sites in Santa Clara County. But there is a darker side to Ananda Marga. Throughout the world, the cult has been connected to violence and bloodshed. The sect's guru, Prabhat Ranjan Sarkar, last name spelled S-A-R-K-A-R, spent 7 years in an Indian jail on charges of murdering 6 defectors. The conviction was reversed on appeal in 1978. In the interim, 7 followers burned themselves to death to protest the guru's prison sentence. Other cultists went on a spree of terrorism aimed at freeing their leader, according to CIA and FBI documents. Among the attacks, an Indian embassy attaché was stabbed in Washington, D.C. An Air India employee was assaulted with a knife in Los Angeles. A brick and a firebomb were thrown through the window of the Air India office in New York City. A police officer and 2 garbage collectors were killed when the Hilton Hotel in Sydney, Australia was bombed during a meeting of 12 Commonwealth ministers. 2 cultists each were sentenced to 16 years in prison for conspiring to murder Australian right-wing extremist Robert Cameron. 2 American cultists were convicted of the attempted murder of an Indian diplomat in the Philippines, one who co-founded the Los Altos Hills Center. One who co-founded the Los Altos Hills Center recently won an acquittal on appeal. A policeman was seriously injured when a bomb exploded in the Air India offices in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. The Indian High Commission office in Canberra, Australia, suffered more than $250,000 in damage from an arson fire. Diplomats and Air India employees in Australia and England were stabbed. In an unrelated 1981 incident, police in Europe are seeking a veteran cult member who allegedly lured a former Ananda Marga monk to Sweden and killed him. Dadaji Danishananda, a spokesman for the group's national headquarters in Denver, acknowledged that some terrorist acts attributed to the cult, quote, may have been committed by misguided youth who have no faith in Ananda Marga ideology. But Ananda Marga is an organization directed to service to humanity and raising the spiritual consciousness of everyone, unquote. The current FBI investigation is based in part on reports that Ananda Marga is planning more terrorist activities, according to an agency source who requested anonymity. Quote, we have investigated them in the past for isolated incidents, the FBI source said. We did not investigate them as an organization until recently. Last October, Indian intelligence agencies notified the FBI that Ananda Marga members were planning to cross the California-Mexico border and assassinate Prime Minister Indira Gandhi during the Cancun summit. And during Pope John Paul II's visit to the Philippines last year, police instituted extreme security measures after Ananda Marga reportedly threatened the Pope's life.
Interrupting the narrative here very briefly, of course, we've seen since that Indira Gandhi was indeed assassinated, albeit in India, and immediately afterward, Indian security officials revealed that there was an international plot behind the assassination of Indira Gandhi. We as yet have not heard any direct attribution as to who may have been behind that plot, but at least a clue has to what has to be regarded as at least a clue comes from where the suspects are being sought. London, Norway, West Germany, and Canada, all of whom are Western nations, specifically NATO countries. And it's also worth noting that Ananda Marga was connected with threats against the life of the Pope when he visited the Philippines. Well, of course, we've dealt at extreme length with the shooting of Pope John Paul II in May of 1981 on this program, and we have connected that with far-right and specifically Nazi elements, and Nazi elements connected to various Western intelligence agencies, including American. So, interesting that we see Ananda Marga connected with threats against the life of the now deceased Indira Gandhi, and also against the life of the so far still living Pope John Paul II.
The U.S. government also has received unconfirmed reports that Ananda Marga, whose membership in the United States has been estimated at 5,000 to 20,000, runs terrorist training camps in California and New York. The State Department has identified similar operations in India. A sect spokesman said the reports are, quote, totally bogus. Yet the FBI considers Ananda Marga to have a high potential for violence. Like other sects, it is based on a strict dogma. Its particular dogma advocates a, quote, one world government, headed by the cult's leaders. The guru, known to his followers as Baba, or Father, predicts that this plan will succeed and that the cult will rule the world by the year 2005. Quote, they foresee the bringing in of that age through violence, said David Fetcho, an ex-cultist. Quote, it's kind of taken for granted that that will happen, unquote. As a preventative measure, the State Department has banned Sarkar, the guru, from entering this country. Quote, our concern is that his presence here might lead to acts of violence, said an Indian Affairs analyst in the department who requested anonymity. No acts of terrorism have been linked to the tax-exempt Los Altos Hills Center, where about 900 disciples have been trained in the group's political and religious beliefs. In fact, Ananda Marga denies any role in the violence attributed to the organization. Rather, spokesmen stress its social welfare programs and the letters of commendation the organization has earned around the world. Quote, I know several Margis, and they are fine, committed people, the State Department official said. Sect spokesmen blame communists for spreading, quote, inaccurate and purposefully misleading statements about the organization. These two groups have a history of antagonism in India. Ananda Marga also blames communists for the April 30th daylight massacre of 17 of its nuns and monks in downtown Calcutta. The victims were stoned and stabbed to death and then piled in a heap and burned.
Continuing in a section of the article by Bernard Bauer entitled Disagreement with Communists. Indian police say that the massacre was caused by rumors that Ananda Marga was stealing children. The sect claims that it was an organized attack by the Communist Party. Whether to protect itself or, as its critics claim, to foster its own violence, the cult maintains a security branch known as VSS. That's V as in Victor. The VSS is the main, quote, violence-prone wing of Ananda Marga, unquote, and is responsible for a series of terrorist acts around the world in 1977 and 78, according to declassified CIA documents. At VSS camps in India, cultists are trained in the use of martial weapons, including knives and nunchukas, martial arts weapons, the U.S. State Department said. There are unconfirmed reports of VSS camps in California and New York, a department official said, quote, but I haven't seen any hard evidence of that, unquote. Jim Venezia, Venezia, Treasurer-Secretary of the VSS National Office in Los Angeles, said all charges of terrorism are, quote, totally bogus, unquote. Venezia said the 70 VSS members in the United States act as a security force to keep order, unquote, during political demonstrations by Ananda Marga members. We don't carry arms, he said. We don't train people in any organized way, but we encourage that people should be prepared to defend themselves, unquote. Like their counterparts overseas, VSS members in the United States wear uniforms of gray shirts with epaulettes, khaki pants, and Australian bush hats, Venezia said. Many U.S. followers seem to be unaware of the charges of evil that critics say permeates the inner sanctum of the cult. It's kind of a schizophrenic group, said Josh Barron, B-A-R-A-N, who runs Sorting It Out, a counseling service in Berkeley for dropouts from cults. There are people that have been involved for years who don't know about that side of things at all, unquote. A former U.S. government official whose son belongs to the sect said that its good deeds are merely a cover for less noble purposes. Quote, despite its idealistic face in the United States, it's basically an organization dedicated to the overthrow of the basic institutions of the United States and the free world, unquote, he said. Like other sources, the former official who has studied Ananda Marga for years declined to be identified because he feared retaliation. Note the reticence to be identified on the part of Ananda Marga's critics here. That is worth taking note of here for our purposes, okay? Again, quoting that State Department official, or no, quoting another former Margi. They, quote, they want to bring about a worldwide transformation of society headed under Ananda Marga principles, said Rabbi Yehuda Fine of New York City, an ex-member. They have the answer, unquote. They are fanatics, another cult member said. Another former cultist said. They will do anything, totally unpredictable. They will kill, and they will die, unquote. At the center of the maelstrom of controversy that swirls around Ananda Marga is the cult's 61-year-old guru, a former railway clerk whose Sanskrit name, Ananda Murti, means embodiment of bliss, unquote. Sarkar spent part of his early manhood living with Subhas Chandra Bose, a radical Indian nationalist who recruited 90,000 soldiers to fight with Hitler and the Japanese against the Allies. I'm going to repeat that last sentence. Sarkar, now recall, this is Sarkar, who's the head of and the founder of Ananda Marga. Sarkar spent part of his early manhood living with Subhas Chandra Bose, a radical Indian nationalist who recruited 90,000 soldiers to fight with Hitler and the Japanese against the Allies. In 1955, Sarkar founded his sect, blending yoga, meditation, and political dogma. The cult was exported to the United States in 1969 in an era when Indian gurus and religions were finding fertile ground among young people in search of alternative lifestyles. Today, there are branches in 38 cities. Precise membership figures are difficult to obtain. Ananda Marga claims 3 million members worldwide, with 20,000 in the United States. The State Department estimates there are only 400,000 members worldwide, with 5,000 in the United States. We tended to be hippies who were leaving drugs and going into meditation, unquote, said former member Karen Weisglass, a computer programmer at the University of California at Berkeley who was among the first devotees in the country. We had a mantra we were supposed to say every morning to the light bulb in the bathroom, unquote. During the early 1970s, Ananda Marga signed up thousands of members in the United States. In India, however, crisis struck the organization. Rumors were circulating that Sarkar was ordering the executions of disloyal priests. Sarkar's wife, Uma, U-M-A, left her husband in October of 1971, saying it was, quote, Impossible for me to be a silent spectator of inhuman, brutal, and senseless happenings, unquote. 2 months later, Sarkar was arrested and charged with murder. I landed in India the day he was arrested, unquote, recalled a former member who was sent to the subcontinent to study with Sarkar. A friend of mine met me at the airport and took me to Delhi, where a group of ex-teachers had gathered. One guy said that he personally trained people to kill, the ex-member said. He said there was a murder committee. I left the cult and never looked back, unquote. Sarkar's followers said that the murder charges were trumped up and that the guru was a victim of political persecution. They staged rallies in the United States and overseas and bought newspaper advertisements protesting Sarkar's innocence. After his acquittal on appeal in 1978, Sarkar embarked on a world tour of Ananda Marga centers. In 1979, defying the State Department ban, he tried to visit the Los Altos Hills Center. He was detained at the San Francisco International Airport and sent away, leaving behind hundreds of angry disciples who charged that their freedom of religion had been violated. Sarkar teaches his followers that the world is in a state of moral and political decay. Both capitalism and communism have failed miserably to meet the material and spiritual needs of mankind, he says. Hope lies only in a massive intellectual revolution, unquote, led by Ananda Marga. If that fails, however, a physical revolution, unquote, is inevitable. No problem of this world can be solved by means of the principle of nonviolence, unquote, Sarkar has written. Let me read that sentence again. This will be useful when we play a tape of some Ananda Marga people responding to this article on One Step Beyond. No problem of the world can be solved by means of the principle of nonviolence, Sarkar has written. One of the texts sold at the Los Altos Hills Center stresses that point. Any act of violent retaliation against tyranny and oppression is justified, unquote, one book says. Nityashuddhanand Avaduta, the saffron-robed Indian monk who runs the Los Altos Hills Center, says that violence is not advocated at the 6-week sessions he runs. He stresses the humanitarian side of the organization, which runs a food program for indigents in San Jose, and the Ananda Marga School for preschoolers situated near the center. The monk says that the guru's teachings have been misinterpreted. I would recall that Jim Jones's People's Temple also had a great many humanitarian and charitable organizations stemming out from it, which served, among other things, to recruit people to the People's Temple. Continuing, the monk says that the guru's teachings have been misinterpreted. We don't support violence, he said, but when the capitalists exploit, naturally the patience of the people is gone. When the resentment becomes more and more, a chaotic situation comes, and that brings violence. As in other cults, life in Ananda Marga is highly regimented. Hours are spent each day in intense meditation. Followers consider the life unifying. Critics call it brainwashing. At its most intense levels, you become just basically lost, washed over with a very psychically pleasurable feeling, ex-disciple Fecho said. Rabbi Fine agrees. There is no doubt that I was in an altered, hypnotized state, he said. The techniques they teach are powerful, mind-altering techniques. Fine says he is now sure he was brainwashed. Otherwise, he said, he could not have belonged to a cult whose symbol includes a swastika, which spokesmen say stands for victory. Even though that has nothing to do with Hitler, the fact that I could sit down and put my hands on that swastika and swear an oath, Fine said. He called Ananda Marga, quote, a mass movement that included one extra item, a hypnotic, spiritual philosophy on top of it all. It scared me as a Jew when I thought of Nazi Germany. Before Nip Tuck reads you another article that appeared on the same page, a couple of points here we might go back to. Take note of the fact that this organization is apparently, according to certain ex-members, very much involved with mind control. And take note of the organization's symbol, okay? Its symbol consists of a 6-pointed star, the Mogen David, the Jewish star, okay, the Star of David. It also has the rising sun. Okay, remember what Imperial Japan's symbol was, of course, the rising sun. It also has a swastika. Now, the swastika is an ancient occult symbol which appears in Indian religion, among other places. Also, American Indians have the swastika. It's worth noting that the Ananda Marga swastika is the Nazi swastika. It turns the opposite direction from the traditional occult symbol, which is sort of a symbol of the life cycle and of the universe. This, the Ananda Marga swastika is the Nazi swastika, which which refers to essentially the imposition of man's will upon the natural cycle. So it is not the traditional occult symbol. It is, in fact, the Nazi swastika. And recall that is merged with not only the Jewish star, but also the rising sun of Japan. Recall the founder of this group, Mr. Sarkar, spent part of his early manhood with Subhas Chandra Bose. Now, he was the Japanese intelligence agent, the protege of elements of the patriotic societies who we looked at earlier. And this particular, when a friend of mine contacted Bernard Bauer, the author of this article, the information about Subhas Chandra Bose recruiting 90,000 troops to fight with Hitler and the Japanese came from the Encyclopedia Britannica. We're going to talk about Subhas Chandra Bose here in a minute, but recall the terrorism and recall the fear of retaliation on behalf of certain critics of the Ananda Marga.
Okay, again, another article from that self-same San Jose Mercury of August 15, 1982. This is also by Bernard Bauer, staff writer. It's headlined, Cult Guru Inspires Devotion, and 7 Supreme Sacrifices. The subheading is, Secret Leader's Murder Conviction was overturned, but his conduct has drawn scrutiny, accusations. To his devout followers, Prabhat Ranjan Sarkar is a god. Quote, I was searching for my guru for years. In Ananda Marga, I do not have to search anymore, said a 28-year-old Trinidad man who trained recently at the Los Altos Hills Center. It is a miracle. Unquote. To others, the guru of Ananda Marga is Satan. Nawal Kishore, K-I-S-H-O-R-E, a former high-ranking monk, wrote in 1975 that Sarkar is, quote, a perverted megalomaniac, whose, quote, murder squads tied disloyal members to trees and stabbed them to death. Quote, it is a fact that, under the guise of spiritual practices, Sarkar and his associates have been indulging in quite heinous crimes, unquote, says a declassified but heavily censored 1980 CIA document. Cult critics say that Sarkar runs his organization as a merciless autocracy and inspires unthinking loyalty in his followers. He was arrested in 1971 after Indian law enforcement agencies uncovered an alleged plot to murder 18 defectors. Sarkar and several followers were charged with 6 murders, as well as kidnapping and weapons possession. From the outset, his followers mounted a long campaign aimed at winning the guru's release. 7 disciples eventually burned themselves to death in protest. 1 self-immolation occurred in the United States, with others in Europe, India, and the Philippines, according to a sect manifesto. Quote, it was seen as a great sacrifice, said ex-member Rabbi Yehuda Fine of New York City. These people were doing the ultimate sacrifice. That's what you were told. Bizarre claims about the sect persisted through the 1970s. Quote, it became a frequent practice for the Ananda Murti, Sarkar, sitting on a chair with a rod in his hand, to chastise errant monks, all of them stripped naked, ex-member Kishore wrote. He used to cane them one by one mercilessly. The Margis were dismayed to find that while some of them got punishments, others continued to enjoy his confidence, particularly those who had brought young boys for the perverted satisfaction of Ananda Murti, unquote. A spokesman for Ananda Marga's national office in Denver called the allegations about Sarkar's behavior, quote, a complete sham. I doubt you would find 1% of truth in them, unquote. In 1976, Sarkar and 4 co-defendants were found guilty of murder and conspiracy to murder and sentenced to life in prison. The conviction was overturned on appeal 2 years later, when a higher court ruled that the testimony of the prosecution's main witness had not been sufficiently corroborated. Still, parents of current members say they are terrified by what seems to be a blind allegiance to the guru. Quote, I don't think anyone would have the drive on their own to go out and burn themselves, one father said. There's some kind of mind control that makes them act as automatons. Okay, so again, the distinction being made here was these are allegations about the cult itself. Now, the Los Altos Hills branch has come under no accusations, and that stress was made several times in the course of the article. But that the allegations about Subhas Chandra Bose's follower, Sarkar, are many and various and fairly unsavory. But of course, it's the political content as well as just simply the ideological content that we want to talk about, and that's what we're going to be concentrating on next.
Now, it's worth noting here that what we have are people who are ostensibly the representatives and inheritors of a transcendental religious tradition who seem remarkably preoccupied with the here and now. Involvement in partisan politics, such as anti-communism, is not traditional with the practitioners of transcendental religion, of which yoga and other similar meditative disciplines are well, they would fall into that category. Okay, and yet the Margis seem curiously preoccupied with the here and now, altogether rooted in the temporal reign, which seems a little unusual for people of their ongoing religious tradition. Now recall that Sarkar spent portions of his young manhood with Subhas Chandra Bose, the Japanese intelligence agent, protege of the secret societies that we looked at before, along with his mentor and for the man who gave him his name, or from whom he took his name, Rash Behari Bose. And recall also that, according to the Encyclopedia Britannica, quoted in that article, Subhas Chandra Bose recruited 90,000 troops to fight not only on behalf of the Japanese, but also on behalf of Hitler in World War II. Recall the Nazi swastika that is part of the Ananda Marga symbol. Now, we're going to read you from a book now which is going to document connections of Subhas Chandra Bose not only to the Japanese, but also to the Third Reich. We're going to read you now from a book called Spies and Traitors of World War II. That was authored by a man named Kurt Singer, S-I-N-G-E-R, and it's copyrighted in 1945. It's hardcover edition by Prentice Hall Incorporated. Okay, so this is right after the end of World War II. Of Subhas Chandra Bose, Singer writes as follows in Spies and Traitors of World War II. History has shown that a strong people can afford to be merciful even to its direst enemies. Bose was beyond doubt an incorrigible. In 1934 and 5, he was busy in Berlin, Vienna, and Rome. He met Hitler and Mussolini. He listened carefully and proceeded with the utmost caution, but he followed in the footsteps of his master and wrote his Mein Kampf, which he entitled India's Struggle. He expressed hearty approval of Mussolini's carnage in Ethiopia. He made Indians who volunteered to fight with Emperor Haile Selassie's troops the butt of furious vituperation. As a climax to his European jaunt, he founded the German Indian Society. One of the honorary directors of the new club was none other than Admiral Walter Wilhelm Canaris. Canaris, by the way, was the head of the Abwehr, German military intelligence at that time. Bose, that's an interjection. Continuing with the text, Bose was granted a long interview with that gentleman, who expressed his warm friendliness toward Bose's dream of an independent India. In Berlin, Bose altered many of his ideas. He had completely dropped his pro-Russian feelings. Now he became race-conscious. A stately figure in his oriental robes, he went on conducted tours through Berlin. His guide was an attractive maiden of the Hitler Youth named Ingeborg. She showed him the later bombed-out Pergamon Museum, the Staatsoper, the Potsdam Drive. They conversed on the Nazi theory of the superiority of the Aryan race. India, after all, was the cradle of the Aryan race. Bose was well pleased with this idea. India rightly belonged to the Aryan Axis group of nations. It was a new slogan and would speed the struggle for freedom. Of course, the Nordic maiden who introduced him to the idea had received instructions from Canaris on the topics on which to touch. But that scarcely mattered. The Nazis put him on the air. Bose addressed the Orient from radio stations in Zeesen and Königswusterhausen. He roundly condemned Great Britain and announced the formation of the Aryan Axis. He extended friendship to Japan. And so again, we have connections here between Subhas Chandra Bose with Hitler and Mussolini with the Abwehr, all of this before World War II. He's conducting propaganda broadcasts now on behalf of the Third Reich. Recall the Ananda Marga symbol with the rising sun of Japan and the Nazi swastika.
Going on, then in 1939, the war started. Bose promptly made a journey to Berlin, where he met Goebbels and the Grand Mufti again. We'll talk about the Grand Mufti some more in a moment. His next steps were dictated by the Canaris office. He was to fight against British control in India and against the influence of Gandhi. You remember, of course, the reference earlier in the broadcast to their opposition to principles of nonviolence. And, of course, Gandhi was the leading advocate of nonviolence in the Indian struggle for independence.
Worth noting that initially Subhas Chandra Bose was an ally and follower of Gandhi's, but he broke with Gandhi specifically over the question of violence.
Gandhi, the great prophet, emphasized that he had no grievances against the British people, but only against their government. He ardently opposed Japan's designs on India and warned Japan that she was not to think of profiting from a British defeat. But Bose harangued his followers in another vein. Quote, "The Axis will give us independence. Let us join with Japan in chasing the British out of India." In 1943, Bose met dictator Hideki Tojo in Tokyo. A Japanese submarine then brought him to the site of Britain's most humiliating defeat, Singapore. Bose recruited his army, raised the flag of Free India. He concluded alliances with other quislings in Thailand and Burma. "On to Delhi" was still his slogan. He referred to himself as the savior of India. Quote, "I, your leader, have millions of pounds of rice ready to be shipped to famine-stricken India, but the British, our implacable and pitiless enemies, have stopped the shipment. They would rather let you starve than accept the succor which is contributed by our friends and allies in Japan." Bose spoke long and loud. He circulated incendiary pamphlets, but all in vain. Traitors are despised by their fellow countrymen. Gandhi earnestly warned against his hypocrisy, and Gandhi's warning was heeded. In Bose's person, the Japanese and German secret services were given the cold shoulder. And there's a footnote that mentions Bose died suddenly in 1945 and never saw the end of the war. This is significant for a variety of reasons. Most significant the fact that he shared lodgings with Sarkar, and that he obviously was still in the flush of his fascist period when he was in contact with Sarkar, since he never got a chance to be rehabilitated, as so many of our other fascist friends seem to be.
Well, again, the point can't be stressed too strongly that Bose was an Axis intelligence agent when Sarkar was living with him. Ask yourself whether an intelligence agent would have somebody living with him and presumably having access to his activities whom he either didn't trust, or ask if he would even have a neutral person living with him. So again, when Sarkar is living with Subhas Chandra Bose, Bose is fraternizing and working on behalf of the likes of Hitler, Goebbels, and so forth. And also, it's worth noting, I think, that the Nazis were very skillful in utilizing nationalist sentiments, in particular nationalists, many of them quite sincere, at least to begin with, in many of the areas of the various empires that existed at that time, Britain in particular. There's a reference here to a fellow named the Grand Mufti. That fellow's name is Haj Amin al-Husseini. He was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem and the spiritual leader of all Palestinian Muslims. He also was a major in the SS, and we've taken a look at connections between some of his followers and the U.S. intelligence apparatus, and specifically the involvement of the son of one of his top followers in the 1972 Olympics massacre in Munich, Germany. So again, we have these threads which are continuous to this day. Now, I think it's also worth taking note of that Indira Gandhi. First let me take note of the fact that you listen to KFJC Los Altos Hills, but also that Mahatma Gandhi, Mohandas Gandhi, was very, very much opposed to Subhas Chandra Bose, because we're going to hear some different statements to that effect made by some of the Ananda Marga people. But recall the Hitler Association, the Japanese Association, and as we saw with the Moonies, that we have links to the Japanese patriotic societies. Okay, and again, as we speculated conceivably with the Moonies, ask yourself whether or not one could consider the Ananda Marga group to be a patriotic society. Recall also Ananda Marga threats against the now-deceased Indira Gandhi and Pope John Paul II, who escaped an assassination attempt on the behalf of Nazis and Western intelligence people.
Okay, we're going to take a short break while we set up for the tape segment of the show that we promised. So since we are running quite long tonight, not going to take up any further time, just a short musical break while we set that self-same tape up, and we'll be back in just a matter of moments. As Dave mentioned, you are listening to as we go into the final segment of tonight's Radio Free America, and fade Dr. John and his gilded splinters that he's walking on into the background. Okay, we're going to play a segment of a One Step Beyond broadcast that was originally aired August 15th, 1982, that self-same Sunday when that article came out. We read that article on the show that night, and again, since it was focused on a group with local connections, we got some rather interesting responses, and you're going to hear those. Once again, this is a tape originally from August 15th of 1982, and I'm told, I haven't listened to this since we broadcast it, Dave's already monitored, and he tells me that I sound pretty hoarse on the tape, so we'll find out. If I'm not my normal dulcet-toned silver-throated self. You'll just have to bear with me. Anything else you want to throw in?
Well, just that when we read this particular article on One Step Beyond, it was not previously announced in any way, and yet a lot of the Ananda Marga people were right on hand to respond after their fashion. And basically, this will sort of serve to give you Ananda Marga's viewpoint. Many of the Ananda Marga people did indeed call up One Step Beyond and disputed what the article in the Mercury News had to say. We'll now give you a chance to hear how the Ananda Marga people responded, and keep in mind the information that we read you about the connections of Bose to the Japanese patriotic societies and the Third Reich intelligence, and his efforts on behalf of the Axis, because that is one of the central points in dispute here. Play about half a side here and a little bit on the other side, and it'll give you a chance to hear what these people had to say and how they sound. And
by the way, I don't know if you just mentioned it, but we did mention several of the other things that we talked about tonight. So this article wasn't given out just as a by itself, but we added some of this historical context with it, which is part of what the people were responding to. Okay, once again, this is an old One Step Beyond broadcast from August of 1982, and when it's done, we'll be back for a little more reading and then hopefully some phones. Good evening, Palo Alto, and welcome to KFJC.
Hello.
Hello, who's this?
This is I am Kirit speaking. I'm listening to a radio station, as well as we had an interview with Channel 11 today.
Uh-huh.
And the reporter came over after reading the news in San Jose Mercury.
Mm-hmm.
I am a active member of Ananda Marga.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been listening to your reputation of the San Jose Mercury coverage.
Uh-huh.
And there are many things that we discussed with Channel 11 reporters today. And, primarily the thing is that the coverage is so out of proportionally terribly out of, you may say, place that we have pretty much declined, for example, to Channel 11 when they came to discuss that matter at any length.
Okay, now wait. Now you're going to have to roll back up here again. And what you're saying is you think that the article was so slanted to begin with that you don't want to discuss it?
It was so out of proportion when they asked what was your feeling about it. I said that, well, it is so out of, so slanted that I do not need to, I should say rather, I don't feel like, I have to say anything about it. Although I am calling to ask you if you have any particular question about it, about this coverage, and,
Sure, I certainly do. First of all, I would ask you, Kirit, how long have you been involved with Ananda Marga?
About 5 to 6 years.
5 to 6 years. Okay, now one of the themes that was running through this article, and was mentioned a couple times, including, I believe, one quote attributed to a gentleman in the State Department whose son was apparently a cult member, was that he felt that a lot of people who were rank-and-file members were not aware, perhaps, of the violent tendencies of the cult. Do you think that could be possible? Not holding you in any way responsible for anything, but is that possible that it could be true that there are aspects to the cult that are not being seen here in the United States?
That may be true, yes. But the point of the whole this regarding violence, I would like to say only this thing, and that is that if such an activity has occurred, then organization or the philosophy of Ananda Marga or ideology of Ananda Marga has not been in support of any of such violent activity. Basic premise of our programs presumes absolute adherence to non-violence and not harming any individuals.
Okay. But then again, they had a quote attributed to Sarkar, am I pronouncing his name correctly? That said that that nonviolence is not a solution, though.
Nonviolence is not a solution in the sense that every time you take a breath, you are killing hundreds of germs, and everything that you do, every movement, if you try to call it nonviolence, it is really, not there. Nonviolence is not. Nonviolence means not harming anyone through mind, action, or your words.
True. But now I think this is largely a semantic difference. I think that what they're talking about and what the question that I'm asking about is the difference between being willing to physically work your will on other people or not. okay, in a way other than merely passive resistance, but to actually...
In Anand Marga, there is never any forcible presentation of any ideas on anybody. In Anand Marga, everybody is free to choose what they think, what they believe, and rationally discuss and present their own views. Anand Marga does not impose its idea on its members, nor do they require anything from their members to participate in any activity as such. Anand Marga membership does not require them to participate in any way, does not require them to believe in any way, does not require that they follow certain items, certain practices anyway. Everybody is absolutely free to take whatever aspect of the programs that they like. As such, we have many programs, many activities with which we deal, education, relief, and many other things that we work with. Many people interested in whatever part, they are free to choose and free to do as they wish.
Okay. 3 quick questions, and you can answer all or any of them you want. The first one would be, and let me just run through the questions, then you can pick them out as you go. The first question would be, why then are you receiving this kind of negative coverage? And I'll just give you 2 right now. Why are you receiving this kind of negative coverage? And second of all, the article claims there's a great deal of antipathy between Ananda Marga and perhaps the Indian Communist Party and communism in general. And why would that be? And what is filtered down to you as, I guess, a rank-and-file member about communism or political lifestyles? So,
Anand Marga has Anand Marga has been in difference with communism for a long time, because we do not believe in communism. We do not believe in regimentation of communism. Anand Marga does not believe in regimenting ideas on anybody, as that article claimed. As I told you, Anand Marga is striving for personal freedom of thought and free expression, speech, all such things. In communist world, it is an absolute disaster, and Anand Marga has been in quite contradiction with communist government.
Okay, now why do you think that it's literally a communist plot, or why do you think that Ananda Marga is receiving this negative publicity? Or if these things, as you seem to be saying, if these claims are unfounded as far as violence, or at least as far as any institutionalized violence? Okay.
See, now, in any organization, any programs, what you have to judge when you talk about Anand Marga is violent, or as this article.
I understand the difference between individual acts of violence and an institutionalized violence. Okay.
Our formal sources have already given a thought, given a view on that. That is that if such members have done such act, that is not an approval, nor is it in line with the thoughts of the organization. Not only that, in my knowledge, such people have been removed from the organization who had, participated in such act. And therefore, I say that Anand Marga has no connection with violence. There would be similar thing as saying that, blaming Christianity for act of Church of Guyana.
All right. Well, there may be more connection there than you think. Okay. Another question that I was trying to get back to, which is then why are you receiving this kind of publicity? If, as you say, Ananda Marga is essentially a helpful, public service-oriented organization with a couple of bad apples. Is it...
Primarily, we've had political differences with the government of India from the very beginning because of the general alliance of Indian government with the Soviet Union. Politically speaking, they were always, Indian government has a standing history of alliance with the Soviet Union. And, at many places in India where we are suffering injustice, especially in the communist states of India such as Bengal, they are claiming that we are CIA agents, or rather we are the agents of so-called capitalist world, or therefore, they are doing all this harm to us. So because of our standing differences with the government, because of our standing position about our disapproval of corrupt governments, etc., and our own philosophy, which is in difference with communism, they have repeatedly tried to destroy our organization. And we have had very significant testimony from very famous international humanist organizations such as International League of Human Rights. All sorts of organizations have examined us, our reports when the trials, etc., were going on against our organization, and they have written a very extensive report in our favor, providing the truth involved. During the emergency days of India, a lot of these activities were carried out during the emergency days of India, and the truth never came out of India. Till this day, truth hasn't come out that our guru was in jail for more than 2 years without charges, formal charges, and he was arrested in December of 71, and not until 1976 that his trial was over, and he was given life imprisonment by Sessions Court, which, according to the famous lawyers of England, as well as British International League of Human Rights representative, a Canadian lawyer, went to India and clearly stated that this thing is nothing but a big farce.
Okay.
The emergency was over in 1978 when the High Court, we took the case to the High Court, and the High Court gave a big judgment in our favor.
Okay.
So the whole thing is nothing but a political mess.
2 last questions, okay, and then I'll let you go. One of them is, Ananda Marga obviously politically aligns itself to the extent of being anti-communist or anti-Indian communism at the very least. How does Ananda Marga stand on what the United States is currently trying to paint as authoritarian governments? For instance, the government of Spain of 15, 20 years ago, current governments of a lot of Central American countries, the right-wing governments.
Ananda Marga does not support communism, nor does it clearly support capitalism. We don't have to support, nor do we have to criticize any particular government of the world. We have our own philosophy, we have our own ideology, and we feel that the progressive-minded people of the world will understand it, and they will accept it through their intellectual understanding of it.
Okay, one last question, which is obviously, if you're claiming 3 million members worldwide, whatever the figure is, whether it's 400,000 or 3 million, it's a fairly large organization with a lot of missions and centers of one kind. Where does Ananda Marga get its money?
Primarily from people like myself who believe in the programs, believe in the activities, and are committed to service to humanity. A large portion of my particular income, as well as some of my friends, as I know, are supporting Ananda Marga. Ananda Marga is not supported by any few rich individuals, nor corporations, nor direct help from governments for its program or any of this sort. Ananda Marga is primarily supported by the voluntary donations from most of the members.
All righty. Well, fine. Thank you for calling, and thank you for answering those questions.
Thank you.
Have a nice night. All right, back to the telephones, 941-2500, if you would like to compare notes with Kirit, the gentleman who just called, who is a Margi, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, or if you have some other things to offer, or even if you want to change the subject, it's up to you, all right? Okay, good enough. Good evening, San Jose, and welcome to One Step Beyond.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, just fine. Who's this?
My name is Jerry Castle.
Hi, Jerry. Go right ahead.
I received a couple calls from friends today saying, "Hi, Jerry, you little old terrorist, you. Kept it a big secret all these years."
Oh, yeah? Are you a
and
member?
I was somewhat amazed when I opened the newspaper this morning.
I take it then that you were, is it Margi? Is that
yes,
correct?
I have been, of course, a United States citizen in Ananda Marga for about 11 years. And I have been to India. I've had the teachers in my home many, many times, and I was very much surprised at the slant that the article had given, simply because in all of these years the emphasis has been on self-improvement, through the yogic practices, in addition to helping other people, through service to the humanity in whichever way you're capable and can do this. And the whole picture presented was somewhat strange, I found.
Okay, well, I would have to ask you the same question that I asked Kirit, who was the last caller, which was, basically you can say certainly that any organization does not preach a certain thing, but you could say that, Catholicism during the 1400s preached love and fellowship with your brothers and sisters, etc., etc. At the same time they were stringing people out on the racks and burning them with hot irons. Is it possible that there is something in this organization at some level that does not concern the average person who's following some of the spiritual
I really
precepts?
don't think so. I have been to India. I have seen the top. I mean, I've been right up to the top. And I think that these are extremely themselves in addition to helping other people around them. No, I would have to say that this could not be. It could not be. I think the big problem there in India is the opposition from the communist government, who goes to great lengths to perpetrate any kind of fraud and bad press for Ananda Marga. Have you ever been to India?
No, I have not.
It's tragic. The people there living just like animals. I mean, thousands and thousands and thousands on the streets, just living off garbage and washing their clothes in dirty water, sewer water. And you begin to look at all this poverty and question, really, if you have to blame somebody, who's the cause for it? Well, obviously it must be the social system, perhaps the government, the people who are making the decisions are not making decisions for the benefit of the whole society. And then you have something like Ananda Marga, who is speaking out against the corruptness in the government and saying that, these poor people living like animals, they need the minimum requirements. They should be guaranteed at least a place to stay and food so that they don't have to live like animals and they can begin to evolve. So that I think the communists get very upset with Ananda Marga, and they do have many, many people there, of course, because it is Indian-based. And they're constantly trying to alleviate some of the sufferings of these poor people there.
Okay, now I can understand that as a premise and as a principle. However, the thing that springs to my mind, the question that I would have to ask is, doesn't it make the anti-communist philosophy of Ananda Marga perhaps seem a little more deeply rooted than just the reasons that you state when you look back and reflect on the fact that Sarkar, who's the leader of the group, was actually part of a pro-Axis group during World War II and was working with, according to this article and apparently other sources, was working with the Axis through his mentor to whatever, to overthrow the British or whatever. But there is that connection, there is that contact.
I think you will find in the reports that come through, and a lot of these come off the wire via India, that there is so much falsehood. I mean, I couldn't begin to tell you. And I have, been very close, like I say, to people, the top people, the top teachers, and there's just so much falsehood in an attempt to discredit Ananda Marga that there is just no basis for it. But it's sensationalism, just like this press. The way everything was shaded, the way everything was worded, was going for not true reporting, but sensationalism. I really think it was tremendously irresponsible for these people to do this because, I'm one of many professional people in this area, and I'm talking doctors, lawyers, accountants, writers, teachers, social workers, psychologists, who have had tremendous nothing but good to say about, what we've been taught through Ananda Marga. It has been a tremendous asset, to your insight, your foresight, and handling your life, dealing with people and making you aware that of other people and other things and other situations. And an article comes out like this with all sorts of intimations, and it's extremely damaging to a lot of very stable
I understand your point. And at risk of seeming to be dragging you through the mud again, I did want to get this point clear, because this is a fairly important point. Now, you are saying, in effect, then, that you feel that these allegations of ties to the Nazis and the Japanese and all that are merely that? They're misinformation?
I'm saying, yes, that much is misinformation. They falsify things. They set up things. They, I've seen so many things in India when I was there that is just what comes across the press and what actually is two entirely different things. And the communists go through great lengths to try to discredit and to set up all sorts of fraudulent situations. And then Ananda Marga's got to retaliate by hiring lawyers and putting a lawsuit out and all of this. The communists just murdered 17 people there in April.
Okay, but
in broad daylight.
But then the Indian police say that that's not true. The Indian police apparently say...
Nonsense. You go to the Indian consulate in San Francisco, and they will admit that everything was true, and they were outraged. Also, of course, that's Indira Gandhi's government. And they would, of course, like to see the communist government out as much as anybody. And the Indian consulate gives full consent to all of this, that the police were not doing their job. Why were the police not there? And why were the police not doing something to stop this? No, that whole situation is absolutely true, And they murdered these people. They dragged them out of their taxi cabs. They gouged out their eyes. They poured gasoline over them. They threw them alive into fires. Early in the morning, people going to work. Nobody stopped. And the police station was right there.
All righty. Well, obviously...
not just, the height, the depths, I should say, of what is happening in India when holy people are burned alive on the streets. Can you imagine the degradation in a culture that has enriched the entire planet with its knowledge of Eastern philosophy, and shared with us and broadened our whole view? It's a treacherous situation there, and the real problems arise when the communist government is in control. They are very much afraid that people are going to see that that service can be done, that something can be done for these poor people. They don't have to scrounge around and scavenger, in garbage cans and eat trash. If the people who are running the government there are sincerely interested in helping the humanity. And this is where the crux of the whole problem lies. You have Ananda Marga on one side saying, look, we're all living together in this world, and we need to help each other, and you've got the government there trying to keep people under their thumbs, under fear, and not doing anything for them, and the communists begin to get a little edgy when a lot of the people are saying, gee, yes, maybe we can be helped. Maybe something can be done. Who can help us? Well, Nanda Marga is helping us, So that so much of this is you're always batting your head against the wall. And in this area, we've done nothing but social service work. We have a tremendous group.
Right. Well, I think the article did specify that there were no complaints made against the Los Altos Center or anything in this area.
I don't think they made that very clear. I think that the thing that came across was, oh my God, we have a cult located locally in the secluded hills of Los Altos.
Oh, well, I don't think
that's what really came across.
No, there was certainly a lot of sensationalism as far as other activities, but I don't think that they overplayed that aspect
did they mention anything about all the work that Ananda Marga has done with the Red Cross in this area for years, and all the letters of commendation that we have gotten from politicians? That's anybody who knows Ananda Marga personally knows what we are. It's just that when an article like this comes out, it's rather damaging because you know how people are about cults these days. There have been so many bad examples of that.
Certainly true.
And right away they catch it and they become very much afraid.
With good reason.
I'm telling you, there are a whole group of very stable, professional family people around here who are tremendously happy with the benefits, from the whole yogic practices and so forth.
All righty.
Anyway, I won't keep you any longer so somebody else can get through.
All right. Thank you for calling.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. All right. Well, we've got 2 people so far who've called up from Ananda Marga, and perhaps some of you out there would like to call and continue this or bring up something else, too. We do have another hour. I'm going to take a break in about 10 minutes, but then we got a whole other hour until 11 o'clock, so I'd love to hear from you. Old Nip's getting a little brain tired tonight, so you have to help me out by coming up with clever and interesting things to say. Anyway, I'm going back to the phones. 941-2500, of course, as always, is the number. And good evening, Los Altos, and welcome to KFJC and One Step Beyond.
Hi, Nip. My name is Sid. I'm a former Margie, and I'd like to play you something interesting what was recorded at one of our meetings.
Doesn't sound like it to me. 941-2500 is the number, and you can give me a call here if you would like to, and let me know what's on your mind, and I will let you know what is on my mind, okay? We do have a few minutes left, and I've got a couple of phone lines open if you'd like to give me a call, and you may go ahead and turn... And Robin's technological expertise has to be seen to be beheld. No, that's not right. Anyway, it doesn't matter. This is Nip Tuck, and I am going back to the phones here at KFJC. Good evening, Los Altos. Welcome to One Step Beyond.
This is Ram. I'm also a former, I'm a Margie of several years.
Former or current?
Current Margie of several years. I have visited India several times, and I've seen Ananda Marga in West Coast and, in this country since '69. And first I would like to say a few things. The article this morning, there were certain false statements, totally or absolutely false.
Which were?
Pointed out. One thing was, the article says the Guru of Ananda Marga he arrived in San Francisco International Airport, and in spite of State Department denying permission, and then he had to be deported, which was, incorrect, because he never came to this country, never came to San Francisco.
He never did. Well, they're saying he got into the airport. You're saying he didn't even do that?
No, he never, because Pan Am, at the request of State Department, refused to carry him from Taiwan. And I was the chairperson, in the reception committee at that time. And we were all, waiting for him. And then, along with the U.S. government, the Chinese government, and also the Japanese, they all acted together in, preventing our guru come to United States.
Okay. Now you said
they were prepared for, meeting him for several months. We were preparing, and we were quite disappointed because here is a great person, a genius, a great saint, who is denied entry into a free country, and this person is so compassionate and only preaches, humanism, and talks about the welfare of this whole planet. And he was denied entry into this country while all kinds of communist leaders and Chinese, the Soviets, the IRA, any person has come here without any problem. This is the first time probably in the history of U.S. that a spiritual master was denied entry.
Okay.
Everybody very sad and upset. That was one misstatement. Other thing was the article says there are terrorist camps in here in Los Altos.
The article said there had been allegations of terrorist camps in California and New York.
That was absolute false. I mean, totally false. It just makes me laugh, and we in fact laughed when we read this. Because not only, you see, all my neighbors around here carry guns and pistols and so forth, but you search our headquarters, there is not even one gun, let alone, they're just so you can imagine, I mean, it is just nonsense, you know. It should not have been written.
Okay,
shred of evidence.
I still have to ask this question, Ram. I have to ask this. Now, you know, you and Jerry the caller before and Keith the first caller are all talking about this, the welfare of all mankind and et cetera, but now these apparently are quotes. They're attributed as quotes, and they're claiming that from Sarkar's writing that there is if the intellectual revolution doesn't happen, the physical revolution is inevitable, and that they're expecting a one-world government by the year 2005 run under the Ananda Marga principles. If nothing else, this definitely sounds like, when you start to put a certain year on something, it doesn't sound like a spiritual thing so much as it does sound like a physical revolution of some kind.
No, I mean, one has to read all the writings. You know, there is a big catalog of books of Ananda Marga, I mean, writings, you know, and you have to look at it in the whole context. Actually, the teacher or the guru of Ananda Marga never advocated violence. And it is like, you know, going through the volumes and volumes with a fine comb and then stumbling on something somewhere in a different context altogether and putting it out in a newspaper. That's how I look at it, because we have a library and everybody is welcome. You know, all Ananda Marga centers are completely open for anybody to walk in any time, day or night, and, you know, there is nothing secrecy here. All the literature is freely available.
Okay, well, now, if you are familiar then with the texts and the context of those, perhaps then you can tell me, what does the year 2005, what's the significance of that? Why a timetable?
There is no one has said year 2005 as far as my knowledge goes. And I don't know how that came along, you know. There is no timetable or anything like that. It is true, I believe, and, you know, many intellectuals and scientists believe around that we are going through a series of crises. You know, this time it is very, I mean, difficult times for many nations around the world. And what I'm saying is, you know, I have not come across any preaching of violence. There has been misquotes. For example, the teacher says, life is full of struggles, and struggle is the essence of life. It has been misquoted in the media as struggle is, violence is the essence of life. There has never been any such quote. I mean, when we talk about struggle, it is even opening up of a bud. A flower is a struggle. The birth of a baby is a struggle. And if we don't struggle, we can never, I mean, life is a continuous struggle. In that sense, it is said. That, in other words, one cannot sit idly and hope the world will, you know, just get better by itself. We have to be active. In that context, it's been said that you have to, and by struggle alone, we develop ourselves physically, psychically, and spiritually, not by sitting idly, you know.
All right.
In Ananda Marga, it's been discouraged that people should not retire into caves or communes and just sit idly meditating. Because the two things is the individual practices where one can meditate or do spiritual practices to, you know, evolve spiritually, and also go out, you know, into the society and help fellow human beings. You know, this is a sort of and it is one helps the other.
Okay.
As you do more service, your personal meditation or that improves, and that further makes you more compassionate and, you know, outgoing to help others. In this way, it is a continuous evolution.
All right. Well, I understand your point, and I'm glad, certainly, that some people involved with Ananda Marga called up tonight and represented their point of view, since it obviously is not. I'm really going to have to get off for the break now, so I'm just to let you know, I'm not cutting you off, but I do have a break coming up. Okay, but I do want to thank you for calling. Can I say one little thing? Sure. It's about the one wrong statement kept in was the Subhash Chandra Bose helping Hitler. It was totally wrong. You know, it should not have been there. I mean, there are volumes of literature. Subhash Chandra Bose was a nationalist
you see, this was during India's rule by British, the colony.
Right, yes, I understand that.
And Mahatma Gandhi was trying for, he tried another method, and Subhash Chandra Bose disagreed with Mahatma Gandhi, and he raised an army of Indians, he called it Indian National Liberation Army, and at that time he was fighting the British in India to get India's freedom. Mm-hmm. And he never collaborated with Hitler or the Japanese or anything like that. I mean, it is a long story. I cannot. Mm-hmm. It was a distortion or misrepresentation.
But you are saying that he did not ally himself with the fascists. He merely fought the British, as opposed to, say, many of the Egyptians who actually did ally themselves with the fascists to fight the British.
No, he was a true nationalist. He wanted India's freedom, independence from the British, and he was fighting the British. And the British happened to be, at that time, fighting the Germans. But anyway, he died prematurely and so forth.
All right. Okay. Well, this is obviously something that some more research into it will have to be done from my angle before I can throw it out anymore. But I do appreciate your calling, and thanks again.
Thank you.
Good night. All right. Coming up to the top of the hour. And coming up to all kinds of tops of the hour, this is Nip Tuck back live in the studio here in 1985. And as Dave so accurately put it, if I thought I was brain tired and brain damaged then, 2.5 years later, it hasn't gotten any better. It's been a long, hard struggle.
Well, it sounds, at least that last caller from Ananda Marga, it sounds like the brain damage was around and about the Los Altos Hills area at that time, because certainly his claims that Subhash Chandra Bose was merely an Indian nationalist and did not get involved with Nazi ideology, was merely using them to try and get the British out, does not stand up too well in light of some of the information we presented from the Kurt Singer book. Certainly, Subhash Chandra Bose was a nationalist, but he obviously was quite willing to work with fascists and apparently became fairly infatuated with Nazi ideology. Proof of that, the fact that the swastika is an ancient Indian symbol, and he used the Nazi swastika, not the Indian swastika. Or at least, we shouldn't say he, because that's not him, but let's say Sarkar used the Nazi swastika. So, Worth keeping in mind. We've now recalled the links between the Japanese patriotic societies and the Moonies, and of course the Moonies in between, and all kinds of elements of American society, including and especially American intelligence, and recall the common links between Rash Behari Bose and Subhash Chandra Bose and the Japanese patriotic societies as well, and of course recall the reports of Ananda Marga plans against the lives of Indira Gandhi and the Pope. And it's interesting that Subhash Chandra Bose was an opponent of Gandhi's, of course, that is to say Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi himself was assassinated shortly after World War II. One can only wonder whether elements of the Bose organization may have been in some way involved in that. That's pure speculation here at this point, a rumination, really, one should say. But keep all of those groups in mind. I think it might also be worth mentioning that obviously, there are elements of the American national security establishment that do not take too kindly to Ananda Marga. The FBI, for example, apparently has been riding a fairly close herd on them. I think sometimes we give the impression on these broadcasts, it's not intentional, but I think perhaps a listener could not help but get the impression that we feel that the American intelligence apparatus is a monolith, which it most assuredly isn't. There are significant divisions within it. Recall that in our Reinhard Gehlen Radio Free America show, we were talking about how Otto Skorzeny was essentially putting together the Odessa, the organization of ex-SS men, and sort of glomming it on to the CIA, whereas other elements of American and British intelligence were reporting this to their superiors.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, quite a bit of our best information about a lot of the things that we talk about comes from people themselves who have been members of these various internal security groups, some of them completely broken with their intelligence groups like Philip Agee and others who still feel that some of the things that their particular intelligence apparati did were quite justified, and some other things that they felt need to be corrected. For instance, a man whom I've interviewed, and we've talked about his book here on the air, a man named Bill Evelyn, who wrote a book called Ropes of Sand, and not wanting to speak for him, but I gathered that Mr. Evelyn's position was that he felt a lot of the things the government had done were good, but that there were other things that were abuses that needed to be corrected. So, as Dave said, and the point does need to be made, we're not subscribing to a monolithic theory. Unfortunately, that makes it difficult difficult because a lot of people like their packages all wrapped up real nice and simple, and all I can say to you folks is, well, your man is in the White House. So, you got another 4 years of simplicity.
Now, of course, one of the thoughts that may have occurred to listeners as they heard the account of the Ananda Marga group is that we have another cult or another large group of that type of Indian origin, which is assuming an increasingly more prominent place in the news, and that, of course, is the Rajneesh group up in Oregon. We are still attempting to find out just what the story is with the Rajneeshis. We do have some interesting information, and by the way, in just a minute, I'm going to plug, when we finish with the last of the prepared portion of the broadcast, we'll tell you about some other programs on KFJC where you can learn more about this type of information. In particular, Mae Brussels' World Watchers International, which is aired twice a week here, and which represents something of a news network in and of itself. Mae has been doing World Watchers for many years now, and one of the results of this is that she has listeners all over the country who send her articles, and in addition to Mae's own magnificent research, and she is the dean of researchers in this field and could be said in a certain sense to be sort of the godmother of these broadcasts, and that she turned us on to the majority of the books we use. Mae, as I said, also gets articles from all around the country, and her World Watchers is at this point something of a news network in and of itself. The research credit for each of the following 3 articles that we're going to conclude the broadcast with does go to Mae Brussels, and actually jointly to Mae Brussels and to some of her World Watchers up in the Pacific Northwest area, specifically in Oregon. The following article appeared just a short section of the article dealing with the Rajneesh group appeared in the Eugene Register Guard of Sunday, November 25th, 1984. It's an article by Mike Stahlberg, and I'm just going to read you a short section of it, talking about the sense of humor of the Rajneeshis. They also find humor in the games people's minds play. Nearly 1/4 of the permanent residents of Rajneeshpuram interviewed in a 1983 University of Oregon survey had degrees in psychology or psychiatry. Not conclusive, but recall the speculation by a number of different people. Mae Brussels was the first to break the story, and then Joe Holsinger, Leo Ryan's administrative assistant, then recapped that information. The suggestion that Jonestown was in fact a mind control experimentation of sorts. And one can only wonder that certainly seems a very high percentage of people to have degrees in psychiatry and psychology. So we shall keep an eye on Rajneeshpuram. There's an interesting thing, sort of apocryphal perhaps in this context, but there's, again, an example of Rajneeshi humor that's listed right above this, and it's talking about an ethnic joke that the Rajneeshis tell on themselves. Question, why did California get AIDS and Oregon get the Rajneeshis? Answer, California had first choice, which may not be quite as funny as we speculated on this program and others about the possibility that AIDS may be a biowarfare weapon. But keep that in mind. Keep in mind that 25% of the people at Rajneeshpuram have degrees in psychology or psychiatry.
Maybe California really did have first choice. I mean, maybe they laid it all out. Who knows? Again, to tie back to some of the things we talked about in the earlier broadcast, again, when we're talking about psychologists and psychiatrists, those particular subdisciplines of medicine have not come up much tonight, obviously, because we've been concentrating on the religious cults themselves. However, those of you who listen to the other 2 Radio Free America broadcasts on the subject of mind control will remember that, of course, a large part of this, all this stuff sprung out of experimentation going on in the psychological and psychiatric professions during the 1950s and 60s. And most of that has been all not completely documented as to the entire breadth and scope of the operations, but the existence of those operations in our institutes of learning and healing have been well documented. And as an example of something that's just cropped up again recently, there are 9 people in Canada who are attempting to sue the United States government right now because of mind control experiments that the CIA does now admit that they sponsored, in which these people were given electroshock therapy far above and beyond the amount that people should get, were given doses of LSD without being told, and various other drugs. The CIA and the American government, in their magnanimity, have offered these people $20,000 each as reparations for having their lives ruined in mind control experiments. This case is, of course, currently still going on, and they have decided not to accept a settlement of $20,000 each. But this is where a lot of this stuff springs from. So when we make a remark about psychology or psychiatry, it's not completely idle speculation. This is, of course, where mind control, as far as we can follow it, sprung from. Anyway, back to the Rajneeshis, and to tie this together with what Dave was just mentioning, again, one of the articles May's listener sent to her. This is again from the Register Guard in Eugene, Oregon, for Tuesday, November 6, 1984. The headline is, "Ex-Rajneeshi joins suit charging he was drugged." Dateline, Seattle. Early last month, after a fight with his wife, James Brooks decided to try life in Rajneeshpuram. That, of course, is the Oregon home base for the Rajneeshis. Now alleging an infection he received at the commune caused him to be hospitalized for psychiatric observation after he returned home, Brooks is back with his wife and has joined in a class-action lawsuit against the Rajneeshis. Frederick Smith, an Oregon lawyer who filed the 9-count suit, predicts it will be joined by as many as 1,000 people who claim they were drugged against their will at the commune. Rajneeshpuram spokeswoman Ma Prem Sunshine said the community would not comment on the cases of individual people who went to the commune. Skipping down. There were constant reminders that the newcomers could register to vote and, quote, worship, meaning work, but there were no demands, and he did neither, Brooks said. This, by the way, they're talking about when they were, the Rajneeshis were recruiting vagrants and street people and the homeless to come live on Rajneeshpuram. Many people have suggested for the purpose of gaining some political control of the county in which the former town of Antelope Valley, which is now Rajneeshpuram, is located. There were constant reminders that the newcomers could register to vote and, quote, worship, meaning work, but there were no demands, and he did neither, Brooks said, the man filing the suit. He did, however, attend free psychological encounter sessions, saying he was told they usually cost $100 an hour for visiting Rajneeshis. A combination of controlled breathing, shouting self-analysis, and astrology. The sessions were intended, quote, to get your energy to flow until the real you comes out, unquote, he said. Quote, until the injection, I had mixed emotions. Some things I liked and some things I didn't, he said. A week after his arrival, a roommate became feverish. Brooks says he was told he would be checked for tuberculosis. He says he got a routine medical exam the night of Sunday, October 14th, then got a shot that was supposed to be the TB test. Quote, I woke up and it was Tuesday, he says. After feeling dizzy, Brooks says something was added to an intravenous tube in his arm and he went back to sleep. Later, he asked to leave. On October 19th, he was given bus transportation to Portland, where his wife Geraldine sent him money to return to Seattle. He arrived depressed and confused. Quote, he came back sluggish, depressed, and cried a lot, she says. James is normally an athlete. Brooks brought with him a letter from Swami Anand Divam, a Rajneeshi doctor addressed, quote, to whom it may concern. The letter said, Felton Walker, which was the pseudonym under which he entered the commune, Felton Walker has hypertension and vertigo and diplopia of unknown etiology, and it recommended further examination. Divam could not be reached for comment. His wife took him to Harborview Medical Center for psychiatric examination. Doctors there found traces of the tranquilizing drug, and it says benzodiazepine in his blood. And of course, that the diazepam, it should be by benzodiazepam. The diazepam family are Valium, and it's marketed under the name Valium.
One more article involving the Rajneeshpuram appeared in the Salem, Oregon Statesman Journal of Wednesday, January 25th of 1984. It's an AP story by Brad Kane, headline, U.S. severs Rajneeshi link to crime information network. Citing the legal questions surrounding Rajneeshpuram, the federal government is denying the Indian Guru city any further access to a national crime information network, an official in Attorney General Dave Frohmeyer's office said Tuesday. And Oregon officials are considering whether to block the city's access to a similar state crime data system, but say no decision has been made yet. Most police departments around the country have links to the National Crime Information Center's computer in Washington, D.C., and can use the network to obtain background information on criminals. The center, which is operated by the FBI, last Friday began denying Rajneeshpuram police any further use of the system, pending the outcome of a suit by Frohmeyer challenging the constitutionality of Rajneeshpuram. Robert Muir, an assistant state attorney general, said the government made its decision solely because of the uncertainty of the issue of the status of the city, unquote. A spokesman for Rajneeshpuram, Mapram Isabel, accused Frohnmayer's office of orchestrating the move to prevent the Central Oregon City's 6-member police force from using the network. This is part of a concerted effort by the Attorney General's office and several other state entities to jeopardize the city and to get rid of Rajneeshpuram, Isabel said. Frohnmayer has acted to stop important data necessary to determine whether wanted criminals in vehicles are coming through Rajneeshpuram. So keep in mind that the Rajneesh people, who now have their own city and their own police force, at least for quite a while, had access to the National Crime Information Center's computer and were able to run background checks on people who'd been arrested, and for whatever purpose. Not the most comforting thought in the world, considering they maybe were able to information like that could be used for blackmail and other purposes of political leverage. Another interesting note to toss in on the Rajneeshpuram, a listener phoned in on our talk shows some weeks back that apparently Steve Davis of Channel 7 up in San Francisco did a series of broadcast reports on the Rajneeshpuram. And one of the things that he revealed was that apparently Rajneeshpuram receives large financial contributions from young German nobility, interestingly enough. So, again, an interesting connection back to Germany. Make of that what you will. Obviously, by no means conclusive, but in light of the connections of the Leighton family through the Phillips back to I.G. Farben and so forth, it's interesting. And again, note all of the many access links that we've touched on in connection one way or another with these cults. The Japanese Patriotic Societies, Japanese war criminals, Bose's links to Japan and Germany, the I.G. Farben connections to Jonestown and so forth. An interesting, not very pretty picture, but one which we have to look at nonetheless.
Now, in all honesty, of course, if we were to concentrate, now all the groups that we've been talking about tonight, with the exception of Jim Jones' People's Temple, are not in the standard American Christian vein, which is, of course, one of the reasons that they get labeled cults. However, in all honesty, it must be said that there are quite a number of groups in the United States that are Christian, straight-ahead American Christian in theology that also fit into the realm of cults too. Dozens and dozens. We could do another 5 or 6 shows. And interestingly, quite a few of them also have these same kinds of connections, and we have been talking about them over time as they have cropped up in various situations. And of course, many of them support the extreme right-wing political agenda as well, as we've been talking about lately. But no time for those tonight. Before we wrap up, I think, Dave, maybe you would want to mention something about some of the other shows that people can catch here on KFJC.
Right. If people would like to sort of follow where the various tendrils of the things we've been talking about in connection with the cults and our other mind control shows go, tune into the regular broadcast that we have during the week. Now, we just concluded reading some information from members of Mae Brussels' World Watchers Network. Her World Watchers International broadcast is aired twice a week here on KFJC. It's aired Sunday morning at 10 o'clock, and for the time being, Wednesdays at 10 when not preempted by Radio Free America. And Mae is the top researcher in the field, the first person to maintain that mind control was being practiced on American citizens, and also the first person to break the information about Jonestown. Now, tune in my colleague's show on Sunday nights from 9 o'clock to 11 o'clock. That's one step beyond a phone-in talk show that sounds very much like what you heard tonight, except minus my voice. Deals with the same kind of material that Mae talks about on World Watchers. Sunday night, 9 to 11. Stay tuned right afterward for Hard Rain from 11 to midnight. That's hosted by yours truly. Also, usually more time for phone calls. Hard Rain also Thursday afternoon, 1:30 to 2.
All right. Well, again, folks, a lot of information tonight. As you may have noticed, we've run smack up to the top of the hour and did not have time for any phone calls, for which we apologize.
By the way, if anybody would like a copy of this or any of the other Radio Free America shows or our Guns of November series on President Kennedy or Uncle Sam and the Swastika, call us up after the broadcast. They are on file and can be obtained.
All right. Very good. Anyway, once again, we want to thank you for joining us, and we will be having more Radio Free Americas, which we will be announcing on the regular shows. So that's a sneaky way of letting you know you're going to have to listen to the regular shows if you want to find out when these big babies are going to be held. So, once again, be back with us. Stick with us here on KFJC. You don't get this kind of stuff just about anywhere else. For Dave Emory, this is Nip Tuck saying goodnight. Thank you for joining us on Radio Free America.